Before we dive in, tell us, what's the most haunted place in your city? Drop your answers in the comments, and we just might feature it in our next spine-chilling video. Now brace yourself for 7 true creepy stories from haunted institutions that will leave you questioning reality. Story number 1. The rain battered the windows of Blackwood University's library, the sound amplified by the eerie silence that cloaked the old building. Sophia Monroe, a junior majoring in literature, was no stranger to the library's labyrinthine halls. But tonight, she was venturing into the forbidden old wing, a place whispered about in hushed tones among students. Rumors surrounded the old wing like a thick fog, stories of books bound in human skin, of eerie screams echoing through the night, and of students disappearing after lingering too long. The university had officially closed off the area decades ago, citing structural instability, but the truth felt much darker. Sophia clutched her notebook tightly, her curiosity outweighing her fear. For her senior thesis, she was researching ancient bookbinding techniques. She had already exhausted the modern collections, and her professor's cryptic comment about the old wing being a treasure trove for the brave had sparked something reckless in her. As she approached the heavy iron gate that separated the old wing from the rest of the library, she hesitated. The gate was padlocked, but the lock hung loose, as if someone, or something, had left it open. A shiver ran down her spine, but she pushed the gate open with a groan that echoed ominously. The air changed the moment she stepped inside. It was colder, damp, and carried a faint metallic scent that reminded her of blood. The shelves loomed high, their spines covered in layers of dust, and the flickering light from her flashlight cast grotesque shadows that seemed to writhe as she moved. Her footsteps were muffled on the threadbare carpet as she wandered deeper into the old wing. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the wooden shelves. Then she saw it, a book lying open on a reading table in the center of the room. Curiosity pulled her forward. The book was enormous, its cover a deep, mottled brown that glistened unnaturally under her flashlight. She reached out hesitantly and ran her fingers over the cover. The texture was wrong. It felt warm, like flesh, and her stomach churned. Inscribed on the cover in faded gold lettering was the title, The Damned Chronicles. The pages were yellowed, and as she turned them, she saw faint impressions of faces, contorted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams. The script was written in a language she didn't recognize, but the words seemed to shift and crawl across the page as if alive. A sudden, sharp scream pierced the silence, and Sophia spun around, her flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. Nothing. The room was empty. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. No answer, but then she heard it, a faint whispering, like dozens of voices murmuring just out of earshot. It was coming from the shelves. Heart pounding, she approached the source of the sound. The books seemed to vibrate, their spines pulsating as if alive. She reached out to pull one from the shelf, but as her fingers touched it, the whispering stopped, and then the book screamed. Sophia stumbled back, dropping the book as its cover writhed and twisted. The face of a woman emerged from the leather, her eyes hollow and her mouth open in a blood-curdling scream. The other books joined in, their covers shifting to reveal tortured faces, all crying out in agony. Sophia bolted for the gate, but as she reached it, the iron bars slammed shut with a deafening clang. "You shouldn't have come here," a deep voice growled from the darkness. Sophia froze, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The voice was followed by the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps. From the shadows emerged a tall, gaunt figure clad in a tattered black robe. His face was obscured by a hood, but his eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark. "This wing is not for the living," the figure said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very walls. Who are you?" Sophia managed to stammer. "I am the keeper of the damned," he replied, "the guardian of these tomes and the secrets they hold." Sophia's mind raced. She had heard whispers of a spectral librarian who roamed the old wing, but she had dismissed them as mere legend. "Please," she pleaded, "I didn't mean to disturb anything. I just..." I just needed to do research for my thesis. The keeper tilted his head, studying her. Curiosity is a dangerous thing, he said, especially here. Sophia's eyes darted around, searching for an escape. But the gate was locked, and the keeper blocked her path. Why are these books like this? She asked, hoping to stall him. These books, the keeper said, gesturing to the shelves, are bound in the flesh of those who sought forbidden knowledge. Their souls are trapped within, their torment eternal. Sophia's stomach turned. That's monstrous. It is justice, the keeper said, his voice cold. And now you have trespassed into their domain. Suddenly, the walls began to ooze a dark, viscous liquid. It dripped down in thick rivulets, staining the floor. The smell was overwhelming, coppery and sickeningly sweet. Sophia's flashlight flickered, and in its dim glow, she saw words forming on the walls. The liquid spelled out her name, followed by a single chilling command. Right. No, she whispered, backing away. I'm not part of this. The keeper raised a skeletal hand, and invisible forces yanked her backward. She was thrown into a chair at the reading table, her wrists and ankles bound by chains that emerged from the wood. Every visitor must contribute, the keeper said, placing a blank book before her. Sophia's breath came in shallow gasps as she stared at the blank book before her. The pale pages seemed to shimmer under the dim light, as if they were alive, hungry. The keeper stood motionless beside her, his skeletal hand resting on the table. His jagged teeth glinted as he grinned, a grotesque smile that radiated malice. Right, he repeated, his voice a guttural growl that made her bones feel as if they were vibrating. The pen in her hand was not ordinary. Its body was made of some kind of polished bone, and its tip glistened with a crimson ink that reeked of copper. She realized with horror that it wasn't ink. It was blood. I won't do this, Sophia whispered, her voice trembling. She tried to drop the pen, but her fingers refused to release it, as if it had fused with her hand. You have no choice, the keeper replied. His glowing eyes burned brighter, and the chains around her wrists tightened, cutting into her skin. Sophia's mind raced as the pen began to move on its own, scrawling jagged lines across the page. She felt an invisible force pressing down on her, as if the book itself was sucking her soul into its blank pages. No, she screamed, straining against the chains. This isn't real. It can't be. But it was real. The pen moved faster, etching words that weren't hers but felt disturbingly familiar. She realized with mounting dread that the book wasn't asking her to create. It was consuming her memories, her fears, her deepest secrets. The first page filled with vivid, horrifying detail. Her childhood trauma, the time she had broken her mother's favorite vase and blamed her younger brother, the first time she had felt truly alone. It all poured out, unfiltered, raw. The words began to twist and shift on the page, forming grotesque images. The broken vase morphed into shattered bones. Her brother's face contorted in pain. Her loneliness became a swirling abyss, dark hands clawing at her from the void. The faces on the other books began to stir, their hollow eyes glowing faintly. They whispered her name, their voices a haunting chorus of despair. Sophia, Sophia, join us. No, she screamed again, tears streaming down her face. Let me go. The keeper chuckled darkly, leaning in so close that she could feel the cold emanating from him. You misunderstand, he said. This is not punishment. This is preservation. Your story will live forever, etched in blood and bound in flesh. You should be honored. Honored, she spat, her voice rising in anger. You're turning me into one of them. She nodded toward the other books, their covers now writhing with faces that silently screamed. The keeper tilted his head as if considering her words. They were like you once, he said. Foolish, defiant. But in the end, they understood. Knowledge comes at a price, and the price is always blood. The room began to shift around her. The walls seemed to close in, the bookshelves stretching and twisting like living things. The air grew heavier, filled with the scent of iron and decay. Sophia's pen continued to move, but now it wrote faster, frantically. She felt her memory slipping away, her identity unraveling with each word. Images of her parents, her friends, her childhood home. They all faded, replaced by a growing void. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, stop." The book's pages began to glow faintly, the words burning themselves into the parchment. Sophia felt a searing pain in her chest, as if something was being ripped from her. "You must finish," the keeper said, his tone cold and final. Sophia's head jerked back as an image flashed in her mind. A blank page, her name written at the top in blood-red ink. Below it were the words, "The story of Sophia Monroe ends here." The chains around her wrists and ankles tightened further, biting into her skin. Blood trickled down, pooling on the floor. She could feel the life draining from her, her heartbeat slowing as the book consumed her. But then something snapped inside her. A spark of defiance flared. She gritted her teeth and forced herself to focus. "If I'm going to die," she thought, "I won't go quietly." Summoning every ounce of strength, she twisted her wrist, forcing the pen to halt. The room shuddered violently, the shelves groaning as if in pain. The keeper hissed, his glowing eyes narrowing. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice a thunderous roar. Sophia didn't answer. Instead, she willed the pen to write something new, something that wasn't her story. The words came slowly at first, jagged and uneven, but they gained momentum as her resolve grew. The keeper stumbled back, his grip on the girl loosening. The chains broke, and the room erupted into chaos. The keeper's eyes widened as he realized what she was doing. "No!" he roared, lunging toward her. But Sophia kept writing, her hand moving with a speed and precision that wasn't her own. The book seemed to respond to her defiance, the pages glowing brighter. The keeper dissolved into shadows, his power shattered by the girl's defiance. The books screamed, their faces melting into oblivion. The gate creaked open, offering her a chance to escape. The room shook violently, the walls cracking as darkness poured in. The keeper howled, his form flickering like a dying flame. "You cannot rewrite your fate," he bellowed. Sophia locked eyes with him, her face pale but determined. "Watch me." With one final stroke, she slammed the pen down, and the book erupted into flames. The keeper's scream echoed through the library as his body disintegrated into ash. The chains snapped, and Sophia collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. The gate to the old wing stood open, the path to freedom beckoning. She staggered to her feet, clutching her side where the chains had cut into her. The books were silent now, their faces gone. The air was still, the oppressive darkness lifting. But as she stepped through the gate, she couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching her. The library was empty when she emerged into the main hall, but the whispers followed her. And in the shadows of the old wing, a new book lay on the table, its cover smooth and pale. The title burned into the leather, "The Girl Who Fought Back." Sophia stumbled out of the old wing of the library, her heart racing as she tried to process what had just happened. The keeper was gone, or so it seemed, but the ominous silence that followed her escape weighed heavy in the air. She glanced over her shoulder one last time, her gaze lingering on the towering doors of the forbidden section, now closed. The sensation of being watched hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown stronger, more oppressive. The library, once a sanctuary of knowledge, now felt like a living entity. The walls seemed to hum faintly, almost as if they were alive. She swore she could hear the echoes of the books, faint whispers that tickled her ears but remained indecipherable. The faint, coppery scent of blood still lingered in her nostrils, refusing to leave her be. Sophia knew she had to leave, not just the library but the entire campus. Whatever this place was, it was beyond her comprehension, and now it had marked her. Her hand brushed against the spot on her chest where the keeper's chains had bound her, and she winced. The skin there felt raw, and when she glanced down, she noticed faint, crimson-etched symbols beginning to take shape, a script she couldn't recognize. Fighting back tears, Sophia bolted for the exit. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the library itself was reluctant to let her go. The shadows danced unnaturally along the walls, stretching toward her. The whispers grew louder, their incomprehensible words rising into a dissonant chant. Just as she reached the grand double doors, they slammed shut before her. The impact sent a gust of stale air into her face. nearly knocking her off balance. A deep, guttural laugh resonated through the space, and her stomach dropped. "You thought you could leave so easily?" A familiar voice growled from behind her. Sophia turned slowly, her breath caught in her throat. The keeper was back, or something worse. His form was no longer skeletal, but a towering mass of shifting shadows and glowing eyes. His jagged teeth floated within the darkness, twisted into an impossibly wide grin. The floor beneath him writhed, as if reality itself was recoiling from his presence. "You rewrote your story," he said, his voice echoing with a sinister reverberation. "But the book isn't done with you, Sophia. It never ends." "I destroyed the book," she shouted, her voice cracking. The keeper chuckled, the sound reverberating through the entire library. "You burned a single copy, foolish girl, but your story is now bound to this place, etched into the very fabric of the library. You're not free, you never were." The whispers around her turned into a cacophony of screams. Sophia clutched her head, her knees buckling under the weight of the sound. She could feel them, hands cold and clammy, brushing against her legs, her arms, her face. Invisible forces tugged at her, pulling her back toward the forbidden wing. "No!" she screamed, clawing at the floor as she was dragged backward. "I won't go back!" The shadows closed in, wrapping around her like a vice. Just as they began to pull her through the threshold of the old wing, Sophia felt something hard press against her hip. Her phone. She fumbled for it with shaking hands, pulling it free and turning on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the shadows like a knife, making them recoil with an ear-piercing screech. The pressure on her body eased slightly, and she scrambled to her feet, shining the light directly at the keeper. His form writhed in agony, the jagged teeth snapping furiously as he shielded himself with an arm of twisting shadows. "You cannot escape," he roared, his voice like thunder. "The library will claim you one way or another." Sophia's mind raced. She knew the flashlight was only a temporary reprieve. If she didn't act fast, the shadows would overwhelm her again. Her eyes darted around the room, landing on the librarian's desk near the entrance. On it sat a brass key, ancient and ornate, its surface etched with symbols similar to the ones on her chest. Without thinking, she sprinted toward the desk. The shadows surged after her, the keeper's howls growing louder. She grabbed the key just as the tendrils of darkness wrapped around her legs, pulling her down. The flashlight clattered to the floor, its beam casting eerie shapes on the walls. "Use it!" a voice hissed in her ear. It was faint, almost drowned out by the cacophony, but it was there, urgent and commanding. Sophia gripped the key tightly and swung it at the tendrils holding her down. To her shock, they dissolved on contact, retreating with anguished cries. She scrambled to her feet again and turned to face the keeper, who now loomed over her, his form a swirling vortex of hatred. The key pulsed in her hand, growing warm. Instinctively, she pointed it at the keeper, and a blinding light erupted from its tip. The shadows screamed as they were torn apart, the keeper's form disintegrating into a cloud of ash and smoke. "You may destroy me," he hissed, his voice barely audible over the roar of the light. "But the library will never let you go." With one final burst of light, the keeper was gone. The library fell silent, the oppressive atmosphere lifting. Sophia stood trembling, the key still glowing faintly in her hand. She turned toward the double doors, which now stood ajar. She didn't hesitate. Clutching the key like a lifeline, she ran out into the night, not stopping until she was far from the campus. Days passed, and Sophia tried to return to a semblance of normalcy. But the marks on her chest never faded, and neither did the feeling of being watched. At night, she would wake to the faint sound of pages turning, the smell of old paper and blood filling her room. One evening, she found a book on her nightstand that hadn't been there before. Its cover was smooth and pale, its title etched in crimson, The Girl Who Escaped. She didn't dare open it, but deep down, she knew the truth. She hadn't truly escaped. The library was part of her now, and it was only a matter of time before it called her back. And this time, she might not be able to leave. Story number 2. The Blackwood Mental Asylum stood as a monument to misery, perched on the edge of an overgrown forest, its jagged silhouette visible even under a veil of thick mist. Its once pristine white walls were now a mottled gray, streaked with grime and decades of neglect. The massive iron gates had rusted into an eternal grimace, warning trespassers to turn back. Yet despite, or perhaps because of, its sinister reputation, the asylum had become a magnet for thrill seekers and urban explorers. For over 50 years, Blackwood had been left untouched, its haunted legacy whispered about in hushed tones. Locals spoke of the asylum as if it were alive, recounting tales of tortured patients, unspeakable experiments, and the relentless screams that had driven the staff to abandon it in the dead of night. No one dared to approach it anymore, not even the bravest of ghost hunters, except for Jake, Ellie, and Noah. They weren't just here to explore the asylum, they were here to document it. Armed with cameras, flashlights, and an almost reckless desire for internet fame, the trio had planned this night for months. But no amount of planning could have prepared them for what they would find inside. The asylum didn't just house the echoes of the past, it had been waiting, watching, hungry for new visitors to claim. The cold hit Ellie first. As soon as she stepped into the asylum's lobby, a chill unlike anything she'd ever felt gripped her. It wasn't just the absence of heat, it was as if the very air was draining the life from her. She pulled her jacket tighter and glanced at Jake and Noah, both of whom seemed unfazed, or were doing a good job pretending to be. "Creepy as hell," Jake muttered, his voice echoing off the cracked tiles and peeling wallpaper. Ellie shone her flashlight around, illuminating broken furniture, shattered glass, and a rusted wheelchair overturned in the corner. The air smelled of mildew and something faintly metallic, like blood. "I can't believe this place is still standing," Noah said, his camera already recording. The device hummed softly, its lens sweeping across the room. "This is going to look insane on video." "Let's just get this over with," Ellie said. She wasn't sure why she'd agreed to this. Jake's charisma had a way of dragging her into things she regretted later. But this felt different. They moved deeper into the asylum, their flashlights flickering against the oppressive darkness. The walls were covered in graffiti, some of it crude, some of it disturbingly detailed. One mural depicted a figure in a lab coat holding a scalpel, surrounded by faceless patients. The words "he never left" were scrawled beneath it in dripping red paint. "This must be about Dr. Crow," Noah said, zooming in on the mural. Ellie shuddered. Dr. Elias Crow was the asylum's most infamous figure, a man whose name was synonymous with cruelty. Stories of his treatments had become urban legends, ranging from electroshock experiments to surgical procedures conducted without anesthesia. When the asylum closed, no one knew what became of him. Some said he'd fled, while others claimed he'd never left. "I swear, if we see that guy's ghost, I'm out of here," Ellie said, half joking. Jake laughed. "Relax. It's just stories to scare people. There's no such thing as ghosts." But as they entered the screaming ward, Ellie began to doubt him. The corridor stretched before them like a dark maw, the walls narrowing as if the building itself was swallowing them whole. Each cell was marked with a rusted number, the doors ajar and creaking in the breeze that somehow made its way inside. "This is it," Jake said, his excitement barely contained. "This is where it happened." "The screaming ward," Noah said, his voice low, "where they kept the patients who didn't make it." Ellie's stomach churned as she peeked into one of the cells. The walls were scarred with deep scratches, as if someone or something had clawed at them relentlessly. The floor was stained with dark patches that looked ominously like dried blood. A sudden clattering sound made her jump, her flashlight darting toward the source. "Relax," Jake said, smirking. He picked up a rusted tin can that had rolled out of one of the cells. "It's just junk." But Ellie wasn't convinced. The air felt heavy here, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Her flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw movement in the corner of her eye. "Did you see that?" she whispered. "See what?" Noah asked, spinning his camera around. Ellie shook her head. Nothing. Never mind. They continued down the corridor, each step echoing loudly in the silence. The further they went, the colder it became, until their breath fogged in front of them. Okay, this is seriously creepy, Noah said, his bravado faltering. Jake stopped abruptly, shining his flashlight on one of the cell doors. The number 13 was scratched into the metal, surrounded by jagged lines that looked like claw marks. This is the one, he said. This is where they say it started. Where what started? Ellie asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. The screams, Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. They say the first patient who died here never stopped screaming. Ellie felt a chill run down her spine. Can we please just keep moving? Jake grinned. What's the matter? Scared? Before she could answer, a faint sound reached their ears. It was distant at first, almost indistinguishable from the wind, but it grew louder with each passing second. It was screaming. Ellie froze, her blood running cold. The sound wasn't just loud. It was agonized, raw, and inhuman. It echoed through the corridor, bouncing off the walls and filling her head. Tell me you guys hear that, Noah said, his voice shaking. Jake nodded, his face pale. For the first time since they'd arrived, he looked genuinely afraid. The screams grew louder, closer, until it felt as if they were coming from every direction at once. Ellie clamped her hands over her ears, but it did little to block out the sound. Let's get out of here, she shouted, her voice barely audible over the din. But as they turned to leave, the cell doors slammed shut in unison, the sound reverberating like a gunshot. And then, the lights went out. Ellie's heart pounded in her chest as the asylum was plunged into darkness. The only illumination came from the flickering beams of their flashlights, which sputtered as if the batteries were dying. Jake! Ellie hissed, her voice trembling. What's happening? Jake didn't answer. He stood frozen, his flashlight trembling in his grip. Noah was furiously fiddling with his camera, the red recording light now an eerie beacon in the suffocating blackness. This isn't right, Noah stammered. The screams had stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that seemed to press against their ears. But the quiet was worse. It was the kind of silence that carried weight, as if the asylum itself was holding its breath, waiting. Then came the whispers. At first, Ellie thought it was the wind sneaking through the cracks in the decrepit building, but the sounds grew distinct. Too human to be the wind. Faint, fragmented voices murmured all around them, their words incomprehensible, yet chillingly intent. Do you hear that? Ellie whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake nodded slowly, his face pale. It's coming from everywhere. The whispers grew louder, circling them like a predator stalking its prey. Ellie's flashlight beam landed on the walls and her breath hitched. Words had appeared, scrawled in jagged, blood-red writing. Stay with us. Nope. 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 Noah muttered, backing away. His flashlight caught a flicker of movement at the far end of the corridor. Did you see that? Ellie gasped, her pulse racing. Jake turned his flashlight toward the same spot, and the three of them froze. A figure stood in the distance, its outline barely discernible in the dim light. It was tall and hunched, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Who? Who's there? Jake called out, his voice shaking. The figure didn't move. Instead, it seemed to dissolve into the shadows, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. We need to leave, Ellie said, her voice cracking. No kidding, Noah agreed, already turning back toward the entrance. But when they retraced their steps, they found the corridor stretching endlessly ahead of them. The iron gate they had entered through was gone, replaced by more darkened halls. This isn't possible, Jake muttered, his voice laced with panic. We just came this way. Ellie's flashlight flickered again, and this time she saw them. Shapes moving in the corners of her vision, darting between the shadows. They were quick, too quick to focus on, but their presence was undeniable. We're not alone, she whispered. The whispers intensified, turning into frantic murmurs that overlapped and grew louder. Ellie clamped her hands over her ears, but it was no use. The voices were inside her head now, filling her mind with chaotic, unrelenting noise. Stay! 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 A sudden burst of cold air hit her, and she stumbled backward. Jake grabbed her arm, steadying her, but his grip was like ice. "Did you feel that?" Ellie asked, her teeth chattering. Jake didn't respond. His eyes were wide, staring past her. Ellie turned to see what he was looking at and immediately wished she hadn't. The figure was back, but this time it was closer, much closer. Its jagged grin stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. Its eyes were hollow, black voids that seemed to pull the light from the room. And it wasn't alone. Dozens of shadowy forms emerged from the cells, their faces contorted in expressions of agony and rage. Chains rattled as they dragged themselves forward, their hollow eyes fixed on the trio. "Run!" Jake shouted, pulling Ellie down the corridor. They sprinted through the twisting halls, the shadows in relentless pursuit. The air grew colder with every step, their breaths visible in the dim light. Ellie's lungs burned, but she didn't dare slow down. Behind them, the whispers had turned into screams, terrified, agonized screams that echoed through the asylum. Noah tripped, his camera skidding across the floor. "Help!" he yelled, scrambling to his feet. Jake and Ellie turned back, but it was too late. The shadows had reached him, their blackened hands gripping his arms and legs. Noah screamed as the figures dragged him into one of the cells, the door slamming shut behind him. "Noah!" Ellie screamed, pounding on the door. But the cell was empty. Ellie and Jake were alone now, the oppressive silence returning as the shadows retreated into the walls. "We have to find him," Ellie said, her voice shaking. Jake shook his head. "He's gone, Ellie. We need to get out of here before—" A low, guttural laugh cut him off. The sound reverberated through the corridor, chilling them to the bone. "Who's there?" Jake demanded, his voice trembling. The laughter grew louder, more deranged. It echoed off the walls, coming from every direction at once. Then he appeared. Dr. Elias Crow stepped out of the shadows, his white lab coat stained with blood. His eyes were piercing, glowing faintly in the darkness, and his lips curled into a twisted smile. "Welcome," he said, his voice smooth and dripping with malice. "It's been so long since I've had visitors." Ellie's breath caught in her throat. The stories hadn't done him justice. He was taller than she'd imagined, his presence commanding and suffocating. In his hand, he held a gleaming scalpel that glinted in the dim light. "Stay back!" Jake shouted, holding up his flashlight like a weapon. Dr. Crow chuckled. "Oh, you misunderstand. You're not leaving. Not alive anyway." The walls began to tremble, the sound of chains rattling growing louder. The cell doors burst open, and the shadowy figures emerged once more, their faces twisted with malevolent glee. "You'll make excellent additions to my collection," Dr. Crow said, stepping closer. Ellie and Jake turned to run, but the corridor had changed. The walls seemed to close in, twisting and shifting like a living maze. "No way out," Dr. Crow whispered, his voice echoing in their heads. Ellie stumbled, her flashlight clattering to the floor. Jake grabbed her arm, pulling her to her feet, but the shadows were closing in. "Ellie!" Jake shouted as the figures dragged him away, his screams echoing through the asylum. Ellie was alone now, the darkness pressing in around her. Dr. Crow's laughter filled the air as the shadows advanced. "Stay with us," they whispered, their voices overlapping in a sinister chorus. Ellie backed into a corner, her heart racing as the shadows surrounded her. The last thing she saw was Dr. Crow's jagged smile as he raised his scalpel. And then there was only darkness. Ellie's consciousness flickered in and out, her mind clawing at the edges of sanity. When she finally opened her eyes, she was lying on a cold, rusted operating table. Thick leather straps pinned her arms and legs, and the air was suffocatingly heavy with the smell of iron and decay. The dim light above her swung precariously, casting grotesque shadows that danced across the cracked tiles of the room. The screams she had heard earlier now felt closer, more personal. Her throat was raw from yelling, though she couldn't remember screaming. The oppressive silence was broken by the distant rattling of chains and a familiar voice dripping with malice. "Ah, awake at last," Dr. Crow's voice echoed from the shadows. Ellie turned her head, and there he was, standing at the edge of the room. His white coat was streaked with fresh blood, his scalpel gleaming under the sickly light. Behind him, the walls were covered in jagged etchings, names scratched into the plaster, each one paired with a horrifyingly detailed sketch of a screaming face. "Where's Jake?" Ellie croaked, her voice weak. Dr. Crow's smile widened, revealing teeth too perfect, too predatory. "Ah, Jake, a fascinating subject. You'll be pleased to know he's been quite cooperative, although he did scream rather magnificently before the end." Ellie's heart sank. Tears stung her eyes as her mind conjured images of Jake's fate. "You're a monster," she spat, her voice shaking with fury. Dr. Crow tilted his head, feigning surprise. "Monster? No, my dear. I'm an artist." He leaned closer, his face inches from hers. "And you? Oh, you're my masterpiece." Ellie struggled against the restraints, but they held firm. The leather dug into her skin, leaving angry red welts. Dr. Crow walked to a tray of instruments nearby, each tool more horrifying than the last. He picked up a long needle and held it up to the light, inspecting it with a perverse sort of admiration. "Did you know," he began, his tone almost conversational, "that fear is the most potent emotion? It seeps into the very essence of a person, leaving a mark even after death. My patients, my subjects, they've left me a wealth of fear to harvest." Ellie's eyes darted around the room, searching for any means of escape. That's when she noticed the mirrors lining the walls. They were old and cracked, their surfaces smeared with what looked like dried blood. As she stared into the nearest one, she realized with growing horror that it wasn't just a reflection. The faces of the asylum's victims were trapped within the glass, their mouths open in silent screams. Their eyes followed her every movement, pleading for help. "Do you see them?" Dr. Crow asked, his voice tinged with pride. "My collection. They keep me company in the dark." Ellie tore her gaze away, bile rising in her throat. Dr. Crow moved closer, the needle poised above her arm. "Now let's see what secrets your fear holds." Before he could pierce her skin, a loud crash echoed through the room. The mirrors shattered simultaneously, their shards flying in all directions. Dr. Crow staggered back, shielding his face. The air grew cold, colder than before, and the screams returned, louder, more furious. The shattered pieces of glass began to move, swirling in a chaotic storm around the room. "What's happening?" Ellie shouted, her voice barely audible over the cacophony. Dr. Crow's face twisted in rage. "No! This is my domain!" But the spirits trapped within the glass had had enough. They emerged from the shards, their translucent forms flickering with rage and despair. "End him!" one of the voices hissed. The spirits surged forward, their hands clawing at Dr. Crow. He screamed, a sound more chilling than any Ellie had heard before, as they dragged him toward one of the mirrors. "No! You can't do this to me! I am the master here!" he bellowed, his voice cracking with desperation. The largest of the mirrors began to reform, its surface rippling like water. The spirits pulled Dr. Crow into it, his body twisting and contorting as he was consumed. His screams faded, replaced by the oppressive silence once more. The spirits turned to Ellie, their faces softening. One of them, a young girl with hollow eyes, reached out and touched the restraints. They snapped open, and Ellie scrambled off the table, her legs shaking. "Go," the girl whispered, "before it's too late." Ellie stumbled through the hallways, her flashlight long gone. The asylum seemed different now, angrier. The walls groaned, and the floor beneath her feet felt unstable, as if the building itself was alive and furious. She reached the front entrance, but it was no longer the gate she had entered through. Instead, a massive door stood before her, its surface etched with the same jagged writing she had seen earlier. "Leave or stay forever." Summoning every ounce of courage, Ellie pushed the door open. Cold air rushed past her as she stepped outside, the oppressive weight of the asylum lifting slightly. But as she turned to look back, she saw something that froze her in place. The asylum was crumbling, its walls collapsing inward. The screams of the spirits echoed into the night as the building devoured itself, finally erasing its horrors from the world. Ellie didn't wait to see the end. She ran, her legs carrying her as far from the asylum as they could. When she finally reached her car, she collapsed into the driver's seat, tears streaming down her face. She drove in silence, the events of the night replaying in her mind. But as she pulled into her driveway, something felt wrong. The air around her was too still, too quiet. Ellie stepped out of the car, her body trembling. She unlocked her front door and entered her home, the familiar surroundings offering little comfort. Then she heard it, a whisper. "Stay with us." Her blood ran cold as she turned toward the sound. Standing in the corner of her living room was a shadowy figure, its jagged grin unmistakable, and behind it, the translucent form of Doctor. Crow loomed, his eyes glowing with malevolent glee. "You thought it was over?" he whispered, his voice dripping with malice. "You'll never escape." The last thing Ellie saw was the scalpel glinting in the moonlight, and then there was only darkness. Story number 3. The rain fell in relentless sheets as Emily stared at the silhouette of the old church. St. Augustine's chapel loomed in the distance, its once pristine white walls now blackened by years of neglect. A single bolt of lightning illuminated its cracked bell tower, casting jagged shadows over the broken gravestones in the adjacent cemetery. For as long as she could remember, the townsfolk spoke of the chapel only in hushed whispers, as though its name alone might summon something malevolent. Emily tightened her grip on her flashlight and pulled her raincoat tighter against the cold. She had always been drawn to mysteries, her thirst for the unknown often overpowering her sense of caution. Her career as a freelance investigator had led her to urban legends and haunted locales before. But St. Augustine's was different. This wasn't just a story. There were too many accounts of strange occurrences, too many people who swore they had heard the sinister hymns or seen the blood-streaked walls. And then there was Father Daniel's death. The image of the priest's body dangling from the bell rope, his flesh marked with inexplicable carvings, sent a shiver down her spine. The photos she'd found in old newspaper archives were grainy, but the expression on his face, a grotesque combination of agony and terror, was burned into her mind. She hadn't told anyone she was coming. She didn't want the warnings, the pleas to stay away. She also didn't want anyone to think she was crazy when she told them what she planned to do. Enter the chapel after dark and uncover the truth about what happened there. The storm masked the sound of her boots crunching on the gravel path leading to the front doors. As she approached, the air grew heavier, colder. She paused, tilting her head toward the towering structure. Was it her imagination, or was there a faint glow emanating from the windows? No, she told herself firmly. The windows were blackened, their glass shattered long ago. It was just her nerves playing tricks on her. She reached the double doors and hesitated, her hand hovering over the iron handle. The wood was warped and damp, but still sturdy. A rusty padlock hung loosely from the door, the chain broken and coiled like a dead snake at her feet. Someone, or something, had been here before her. Swallowing her fear, Emily pushed the door open. The door groaned on its hinges, the sound echoing into the cavernous darkness beyond. Emily stepped inside, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The air was stifling, heavy with the scent of mildew and something sharper, metallic, like old blood. She shivered. Though the air wasn't cold, it felt alive, pressing against her skin like invisible hands. The beam of her flashlight revealed rows of pews, each coated in a thick layer of dust. Cobwebs hung like veils from the ceiling, swaying gently in a breeze she couldn't feel. The altar at the far end of the chapel was shrouded in shadow, its once gleaming marble now dull and cracked. Above it hung a large wooden cross, its edges darkened as though scorched. Emily's footsteps echoed unnaturally loud as she ventured deeper into the room. She moved slowly, her eyes darting to every shadow, every flicker of movement at the edge of her vision. And then she heard it. The rain fell in relentless sheets as Emily stared at the silhouette of the old church. St. Augustine's Chapel loomed in the distance, its once pristine white walls now blackened by years of neglect. A single bolt of lightning illuminated its cracked bell tower, casting jagged shadows over the broken gravestones in the adjacent cemetery. For as long as she could remember, the townsfolk spoke of the chapel only in hushed whispers, as though its name alone might summon something malevolent. Emily tightened her grip on her flashlight and pulled her raincoat tighter against the cold. She had always been drawn to mysteries, her thirst for the unknown often overpowering her sense of caution. Her career as a freelance investigator had led her to urban legends and haunted locales before, but St. Augustine's was different. This wasn't just a story. There were too many accounts of strange occurrences, too many people who swore they had heard the sinister hymns or seen the blood-streaked walls. And then there was Father Daniel's death. The image of the priest's body dangling from the bell rope, his flesh marked with inexplicable carvings, sent a shiver down her spine. The photos she'd found in old newspaper archives were grainy, but the expression on his face, a grotesque combination of agony and terror, was burned into her mind. She hadn't told anyone she was coming. She didn't want the warnings, the pleas to stay away. She also didn't want anyone to think she was crazy when she told them what she planned to do. Enter the chapel after dark and uncover the truth about what happened there. The storm masked the sound of her boots crunching on the gravel path leading to the front doors. As she approached, the air grew heavier, colder. She paused, tilting her head toward the towering structure. Was it her imagination, or was there a faint glow emanating from the windows? No, she told herself firmly. The windows were blackened, their glass shattered long ago. It was just her nerves playing tricks on her. She reached the double doors and hesitated, her hand hovering over the iron handle. The wood was warped and damp, but still sturdy. A rusty padlock hung loosely from the door, the chain broken and coiled like a dead snake at her feet. Someone, or something, had been here before her. Swallowing her fear, Emily pushed the door open. The door groaned on its hinges, the sound echoing into the cavernous darkness beyond. Emily stepped inside, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The air was stifling, heavy with the scent of mildew and something sharper, metallic, like old blood. She shivered, though the air wasn't cold. It felt alive, pressing against her skin like invisible hands. The beam of her flashlight revealed rows of pews, each coated in a thick layer of dust. Cobwebs hung like veils from the ceiling, swaying gently in a breeze she couldn't feel. The altar at the far end of the chapel was shrouded in shadow, its once gleaming marble now dull and cracked. Above it hung a large wooden cross, its edges darkened as though scorched. Emily's footsteps echoed unnaturally loud as she ventured deeper into the room. She moved slowly, her eyes darting to every shadow, every flicker of movement at the edge of her vision. And then she heard it, a low, mournful hum. It was faint at first, like the distant drone of a funeral dirge. She froze, straining to pinpoint its source, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. Her heart pounded as she scanned the room. The flashlight's beam swept across the pews, illuminating carvings etched into the wood. They were deep and jagged, forming patterns that seemed almost deliberate, though their meaning was lost on her. The hum grew louder, joined by a chorus of dissonant voices. It wasn't a hymn. It was something darker, twisted, as though mocking the sacred rituals once performed here. Emily's breath hitched when she saw them. Figures, shadowy, barely visible, seated in the pews. Their heads were bowed, their forms flickering like flames in a breeze. Her grip on the flashlight tightened as she stepped closer. The figures didn't move, didn't acknowledge her presence. She could see no details, no faces, no features, just vague, human-like shapes. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. The humming stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, and Emily felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. The shadows in the pews turned their heads in unison, their movements slow and deliberate. Red eyes glowed in the darkness, dozens of them, staring directly at her. Emily stumbled back, her flashlight shaking in her hand. "This isn't real," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own heartbeat. One of the figures stood, its form stretching unnaturally tall, its limbs elongating in ways that defied human anatomy. The red eyes burned brighter, and the sound of wood scraping against stone filled the air as more figures began to rise. Panic overtook her, and she turned to run. But as she did, the door slammed shut behind her with a thunderous crash. The air grew colder, and the faint scent of blood became overwhelming. Emily turned back to the altar, her flashlight beam catching movement. The cross above the altar began to drip. Thick, dark liquid oozed from its edges, staining the stone below. The liquid pooled and spread, forming words. Her name, Emily. Her legs felt like lead, her body frozen in place. The chanting resumed, louder this time, the voices overlapping in a discordant symphony. The shadows began to advance, their red eyes fixed on her, their forms twisting and writhing as they closed the distance. "Leave me alone," she screamed, swinging the flashlight wildly. But the shadows didn't stop, and somewhere deep within the chapel, a bell began to toll. The bell's sound reverberated through the very core of Emily's being, filling her chest with a heavy, oppressive weight. She backed up slowly, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Every inch of the chapel seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing inward as though the very building was alive, suffocating her. The red-eyed figures moved forward, but they didn't hurry. It was as though they knew she couldn't escape, that the chapel had already claimed her. The cold liquid dripping from the cross continued to pool around her feet. Emily could feel it creeping up her ankles, cold and sticky, like the breath of something ancient and terrible. The liquid seemed to pulse with a life of its own, surging closer as if trying to swallow her whole. Her flashlight flickered and died. The sudden darkness was suffocating. She was left in the near-total blackness, with only the sound of her own breathing to keep her company. The figures in the pews weren't moving anymore, but Emily could feel their eyes on her, those glowing red eyes that pierced the darkness. The bell tolled again, its sound growing louder, as though it were right next to her ear. She reached out, her trembling hand grazing the nearest pew. It was damp to the touch, slick with the same cold, sticky substance that surrounded her feet. Suddenly, she heard the distinct creak of footsteps. Slow, deliberate. The sound seemed to come from all directions, but when she turned her head, there was nothing there. "Who's there?" Emily's voice cracked, barely a whisper. The footsteps grew louder, faster. She whipped her head around, but still, no one was visible. Her panic was rising, but she couldn't scream. Not now. Not with those eyes watching her. Not with that awful sound of the bell tolling in her skull. And then she saw it, a figure standing near the altar. At first she thought it was just another shadow, but this one was different. It wasn't like the others who sat quietly in the pews. This figure moved like a man. Its form was more solid, more defined, though still shrouded in darkness. But she could see the outline clearly now, a tall, slender shape draped in a black robe, its face hidden in shadow. The bell tolled again, the sound filling the chapel with an eerie resonance. The figure turned slowly, its head tilting as though it were considering her. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she realized that it wasn't just standing still, it was looking at her. "Stay with us." The voice was low, gravelly, like the scraping of a coffin lid. It was the voice of the priest, or someone who had once been the priest. But now he was something else entirely, something far darker. The shadow took a step toward her, its footsteps echoing in the cavernous room. Emily could feel the air grow heavier, thickening as if the chapel was closing in on her from all sides. Her breath hitched in her throat as the figure stepped closer, the faintest trace of a grin forming beneath the darkness of its hood. "Stay with us," it repeated, its voice louder now, more insistent. "You're already here." Emily's mind screamed for her to move, but her body felt rooted to the floor. The walls pressed closer, the altar warped in her vision, its blood-streaked cross now pulsing in time with her heartbeat. The figure's steps slowed as it reached the first row of pews. Emily could feel her legs shaking, but she couldn't move, couldn't tear her eyes away from the thing that approached her. It was so close now, close enough that she could see the hints of a face beneath the hood. Just a flash of skin, sickly pale, eyes black as coal, and they were fixed on her. Suddenly the bell tolled one final time. The sound was deafening, reverberating in her skull. She cried out, the scream echoing through the chapel as her body convulsed, her chest tight with terror. "Come closer," the figure whispered, and Emily felt the air grow colder still. A coldness that was unlike any she had ever experienced. Her breath came in ragged bursts, her chest heaving. "Come to me, Emily." Before she could respond, the chapel door slammed shut with a deafening bang, sealing her inside. Emily stood frozen, her body trembling uncontrollably. The chapel was still, save for the low hum of that oppressive presence filling the air. She could feel it closing in around her, the very walls alive with malice, the floor beneath her feet warm and sticky, the sound of her own heartbeat deafening. "Don't fight it," the figure intoned, its voice smooth as silk, but there was no mistaking the venom in its words. "You belong to us now." The shadow moved closer, its form almost solid now, no longer flickering like the others. It was taller than she remembered, looming over her with unnatural grace, its eyes glowing a deeper red. Her breath caught in her throat. The figure reached out a hand, skeletal fingers curling toward her face, a movement that sent a shiver down her spine. "Take your place, Emily. You've been called." The words sent a shock of panic through her, and she suddenly regained control of her legs. She staggered backward, but as soon as she took a step, the floor seemed to lurch beneath her. It was as though the ground was shifting, undulating like water, making her movements slow and clumsy. But she couldn't run. She couldn't escape. She whirled around, eyes frantically searching for any possible way out. But the walls seemed to shift, closing in on her. The same red eyes glowed from the pews, from the corners of the chapel. They followed her every movement, growing brighter and brighter with every passing second. "You can't leave," the figure said, its voice now a low, mocking laugh. "No one leaves this place, not once you've entered." Emily screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the bells tolling, the mournful clang now resonating deep within her chest. It was as if her soul was being dragged closer to the altar, to the center of the chapel. And then, as though on cue, the shadows in the pews began to stir. Slowly they rose one by one, all of them fixed on her, their red eyes burning with unrelenting hunger. Emily's heart raced as the sound of her breathing drowned in the cacophony of whispers that filled the chapel. They were closing in. She was surrounded. "Stay with us. Forever," the priest-like figure said, its smile now impossibly wide, filled with jagged teeth. The walls began to move, closing in on her, the cross above the altar now dripping blood more profusely, the liquid oozing from the wood like tar. It was pouring from the edges of the cross, spilling onto the floor and swirling around her feet. Her legs finally gave way, her knees buckling as she collapsed onto the stone floor. She gasped for air, but there was none to breathe. The chapel was suffocating her, pulling her in. And then, with one final defiant scream, she was pulled into the shadows. The chapel doors swung open, but no one could hear her cries. The bell tolled one final time. The world around Emily spun violently as she was drawn deeper into the darkness. The air was thick and damp, suffocating her with every breath, as though the chapel itself were alive and breathing. Her body felt heavy, as if shackled to the ground, and each movement she made was sluggish and weak. The shadows had surrounded her now, no longer just watching from afar but closing in, their forms blending into the very walls of the church. They whispered in unison, their voices like a distant chant, incomprehensible yet chilling to her very core. "Stay with us. Forever." The words seemed to be coming from every direction at once, vibrating through her skull, each one ringing like a death knell. Her heart hammered in her chest as she struggled against the invisible forces that held her. Her limbs felt as though they were sinking into the cold stone floor, her muscles refusing to obey. The shadows, black and formless, swirled around her like a storm, their hands, or what could have been hands, reaching for her, cold as the grave. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run, but her throat was tight, and her body refused to cooperate. The shadows moved closer, their icy fingers grazing her skin, sending bolts of terror through her. She tried to lash out, but her limbs wouldn't move. Every time she tried to break free, the cold pressed in on her harder, as if the very chapel was forcing her to stay. And then, she saw him again, the figure in the robe. He had moved closer, so close now that she could feel the heat radiating from him. The priest's eyes glowed like fiery embers, but they held no warmth, no compassion, only hunger. His smile widened, impossibly wide, the jagged teeth gleaming like knives. "You've come," he said, his voice a guttural rasp that scraped at her soul. "And now you belong to us." He extended one skeletal hand toward her, and as it touched her forehead, the world around her seemed to collapse. The walls of the chapel shifted, contracting and expanding with an unnatural rhythm, the air growing even thicker, more oppressive. Her vision blurred as the shadows crowded in closer, the sounds of the chapel blending with her screams. But they were no longer her screams. No, now they were the screams of all the lost souls that had entered the chapel before her, their voices becoming one, overlapping in a chorus of torment. Their pain clawed at her mind, pulling her deeper into the abyss. She could feel their hands on her, pressing against her skin, cold and clammy, dragging her toward the altar, toward the endless darkness. "No, no," she gasped, her breath shallow and frantic. "I don't want this. Please." But the shadows were relentless. The priest's hands tightened on her, and her vision snapped back to reality. The chapel walls had turned a sickening shade of red, blood pouring down from the cross above the altar, pooling at her feet. It was warm, unnervingly warm, and the scent of iron filled her nostrils, suffocating her. The walls oozed with the same blood-like substance, creeping toward her like tendrils, wrapping around her ankles and pulling her closer to the altar. "You're ours now," the priest murmured. "Your soul is bound here, in this place of eternal torment." Emily's limbs moved against her will, her body jerking toward the altar, dragged by invisible chains. She tried to resist, but it was futile. Her body no longer belonged to her. The shadows were inside her now, crawling through her veins, feeding on her fear. The priest's laughter echoed in her ears, twisted and unholy, as if the chapel itself were mocking her desperate attempts to escape. And then, the world went black. When Emily's eyes opened again, she wasn't sure if she was still alive. The world around her was suffocatingly dark, and there was a strange pressure in the air, as if the very weight of the place was crushing her. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The sounds of the chapel, of the bell tolling, had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that made her ears ring. Her body felt numb, her limbs stiff and unresponsive, as though they were frozen in place. The blood on the floor had stopped flowing, but the air still carried the coppery scent of iron. The shadows had disappeared, but their presence lingered, thick and suffocating. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice barely a sound in the thick, stagnant air. No answer came, not from the shadows, not from the priest, only the silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Then slowly she realized something. She wasn't alone. From the corners of her vision, faint figures began to appear. Their shapes were indistinct, like ghosts caught between the world of the living and the dead. Their outlines flickered in and out of existence, some of them standing motionless, while others moved in slow, deliberate motions. The figures were people, students, travelers, wanderers, each one with eyes that glowed a sickly red, like the priests. They were all here, trapped like her. She could feel their presence now, the weight of their eyes, the hunger in their stare. Their expressions were hollow, devoid of hope or purpose. They were all victims of the chapel, each one taken in by its malevolent call, and now she was one of them. She opened her mouth to scream, but the sound caught in her throat. It was as if the darkness itself was choking her. The faces around her twisted into grotesque masks, their eyes wide and pleading, mouths stretched into silent screams. Emily could feel their despair, their torment mingling with her own, growing louder, more frantic. She was becoming one of them. The priest's voice echoed in the distance, distant but unmistakable. "This is your eternity now," he said. "No more escape. You belong to the chapel, to the darkness, and the darkness will never let you go." Emily's heart stopped. Her body jerked involuntarily, her chest tightening as she realized the horrible truth. She was trapped here, like all the others, bound by the same invisible chains that had claimed the souls before her. Her eyes locked onto the altar, and she saw a familiar shape there, the cross. But it was different now. The blood that had once dripped from it had turned black, congealing in thick pools that stained the stone floor. And at the foot of the cross, she saw a name written in blood. Her name! She screamed, but the sound was drowned out by the overwhelming silence that filled the chapel, a silence that would never end. The darkness had claimed her, and there was no escape. Story number 4. The walls of the hospital were riddled with signs of decay. The once sterile white of the tiles had turned into an off-putting yellowish hue, stained by years of neglect. Cobwebs clung to the corners of the ceiling, and broken glass littered the floor. It was as though the hospital had been abandoned overnight, left to rot in the quiet embrace of time. Darren moved cautiously, his flashlight sweeping back and forth as he advanced. The beams of light flickered erratically, making the shadows shift in unnatural ways. There were rooms here, some opened, others locked tight. The doors groaned as Darren pushed them open, each room revealing only more desolation. Empty hospital beds, rusty medical equipment, and old charts scattered across the floor were all that remained. The air felt cold, unnaturally so. A chill seeped into his bones, and his breath misted in the air as he continued his journey through the haunted hallways. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that someone, or something, was silently following him from the shadows. His flashlight flickered again, casting grotesque shadows on the cracked walls. It was then that he saw it. At the end of the hallway, just beyond a half-open door, he caught sight of a figure. A woman, dressed in an old-fashioned nurse's uniform, her face hidden in the shadows. Her posture was stiff, like a statue, unmoving and lifeless. Her uniform, once white, was stained with something dark, something red. The dim light of the hallway barely illuminated her, but Darren could make out her form enough to see that she wasn't simply a figment of his imagination. She was real. His heart pounded, but his feet didn't move. Part of him wanted to run, to turn and escape back to the safety of the world outside. But curiosity anchored him in place, and against every instinct in his body, Darren stepped forward. As he walked closer, the figure didn't move. She remained there, her back turned to him, almost as if she were waiting. The silence of the hospital was broken only by the soft scrape of his boots on the dusty floor. "Excuse me?" Darren called out, his voice more timid than he intended. Are you okay?" There was no response. The figure remained perfectly still, her head hanging slightly forward, her body unmoving. "Hello?" he called again, this time a little louder. The nurse's head slowly lifted, and in the dim light, Darren could see her face, a pale, ashen complexion, hollowed eyes, and a tight-lipped smile that seemed unnatural. But it wasn't her face that terrified him the most. It was the eyes that gleamed with an eerie, unnatural glow. They were the color of blood, dark and gleaming, like they had seen too much. And then she spoke, her voice a soft, sickly whisper. "Can I help you?" Darren froze. The words, so simple yet so chilling, seemed to wrap around his mind like a cold vice. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. He couldn't move. It wasn't until she took a step toward him that he snapped out of his trance, stumbling backward. The flashlight in his hand flickered and then died completely, plunging him into darkness. Panic surged through his chest. He turned to run but felt a cold hand grasp his wrist, holding him in place. Her grip was surprisingly strong for someone who appeared to be nothing more than a ghost. He tried to pull away, but the pressure was unrelenting. He heard her whisper again, her voice like ice sliding down his spine. "Don't be afraid, I can help you." With a surge of adrenaline, Darren broke free from her grasp and stumbled backward. His eyes were wide, his breath ragged, as he fumbled for the door behind him. managing to push it open and spill out into the hallway. The nurse remained where she stood, her gaze fixed on him, as if she were watching him closely, waiting. Darren didn't look back as he ran. He didn't dare to. The nurse's words echoed in his mind, twisting and turning like a mantra. "I can help you." But help? What kind of help was that? He reached a nearby stairwell, breathless and trembling. His legs felt weak as he clung to the rail, fighting the dizziness that threatened to overwhelm him. He needed to leave. He needed to escape the suffocating grip of fear that seemed to cling to every inch of this hospital. But as he looked up, he saw something that made his blood run cold. There at the top of the stairwell, standing in the shadows, was the nurse once again. Only this time, there was something different. Her eyes, they weren't glowing anymore. Instead, they were empty, hollow. She was no longer smiling. She was crying. Tears, dark and viscous, dripped from her eyes like blood. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You need my help." Darren didn't wait to hear more. He ran up the stairs, heart pounding, but when he reached the top, the hallway stretched endlessly before him, like a maze. Every turn seemed to lead him back to the same spot, and every time he turned, he saw her again. No matter where he went, she was there. Darren had no idea how long he'd been wandering the hallways of the hospital. The minutes, or hours, seemed to blur together. He had lost track of time. His heart hammered in his chest and his legs burned with exhaustion. But no matter how fast he ran, no matter how many times he tried to escape, the nurse always found him. The walls seemed to close in on him, each hallway identical to the last, each room a mirror image of the one before. It was as though the building itself had swallowed him whole. He couldn't escape. And then finally he was back in the room where it had all started, the room with the old examination table, the room where she had first touched him, where she had promised him treatment. But this time, it was different. The room was no longer abandoned. It was sterile, clean. The smell of antiseptic filled the air, and the surgical lights above him buzzed to life. The nurse stood by the table, her back turned to him. As he looked at her, his heart sank. Her uniform was once again pristine, the bloodstains gone. She seemed to be waiting for him. "You can't run forever," she whispered, her voice carrying a sickly sweetness. Darren didn't have the strength to fight anymore. His body felt heavy, his mind numb. He stumbled toward the table, his eyes fixed on the nurse. This time, when she turned to face him, there was no smile, just a cold, pitiless gaze. "Are you ready?" she asked, her hands already reaching for the tools that lay on the table. Darren could only nod, and the treatment began. The examination table was cold, sending a shock through Darren's body as he lay back, his breath shallow and uneven. His heart pounded in his chest, and every instinct screamed at him to fight, to run, to resist. But his body no longer obeyed. It was as though the weight of the room itself had pinned him down, making him a prisoner in his own skin. Above him, the harsh surgical light flickered, casting eerie shadows on the pristine walls. The nurse moved with clinical precision, her movements deliberate yet hauntingly graceful. Her white uniform was spotless, the previous stains of blood nowhere to be seen. Yet there was something deeply unsettling about her presence. Something wrong. She reached for the tray beside the table, her hands hovering over an array of instruments. The tools gleamed under the flickering light. Scalpels, syringes, and devices Darren couldn't even begin to recognize. Each one looked ancient, as though they belonged in a museum rather than a modern hospital. "You've been running," the nurse said softly, her voice devoid of emotion but dripping with authority. "But it's time to rest now. You need care." Darren's lips trembled as he tried to speak, but no sound came out. His throat felt as though it had been stitched shut. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, but there was none. The door he had entered through was gone, replaced by a blank, featureless wall. The room felt smaller now, as though it were closing in on him. The nurse leaned over him, her face inches from his own. Her eyes, dark, empty voids, bored into him, draining him of any remaining hope. Her breath was cold against his skin, smelling faintly of antiseptic and decay. "Shh," she whispered, placing a gloved finger against his lips. "There's no need to be afraid. This is for your own good." Her words sent a chill down Darren's spine. He tried to scream, to thrash, to do anything, but his body remained still, paralyzed by an invisible force. His mind raced, replaying every decision that had led him here, every step that had brought him to this cursed place. He wanted to wake up, to believe that this was some horrific nightmare, but the sharp edge of reality cut through his thoughts. The nurse picked up a scalpel, its blade glinting ominously in the dim light. She held it delicately, like an artist preparing to craft a masterpiece. "Your heart," she murmured, her voice almost reverent. "It's beating too fast. We'll have to slow it down." Darren's eyes widened in terror as she pressed the scalpel to his chest. The blade was impossibly cold, sending shock waves through his body. He expected pain, unbearable pain, but there was none. Instead, there was a strange numbness, as though his body no longer belonged to him. The nurse began to cut, her movements steady and precise. Blood oozed from the incision, dark and thick, but Darren felt nothing. He could only watch in horrified silence as she worked, her expression one of calm concentration. Her hands moved with an eerie confidence, as though she had performed this procedure countless times before. "You've been carrying so much fear," she said, her voice almost tender. "It's unhealthy. Fear poisons the mind, the body, the soul. But don't worry, I'll take it away." Her words made no sense, yet they filled Darren with a deep, primal dread. He wanted to protest, to beg for mercy, but his body refused to cooperate. The nurse reached deeper into his chest, her gloved hands disappearing beneath the surface of his skin. He could feel the pressure, the unnatural tugging as she worked, but still, there was no pain. And then she pulled it out. It was his heart. Darren stared in mute horror as the nurse held his heart in her hands. It was still beating, slow and rhythmic, the sound echoing unnaturally in the small room. The organ glistened with blood, its surface marred by faint, intricate carvings, symbols that Darren couldn't decipher but felt instinctively were wrong. "This is the source of your fear," the nurse said, her voice soft but firm. "It's damaged, corrupted. I'll need to fix it." She placed the heart on the tray beside her and began to work, her hands moving with the precision of a surgeon and the fervor of an artist. She stitched and carved, her tools glinting as they sliced into the fragile flesh. Darren couldn't look away, even as his stomach churned and his mind screamed in protest. As she worked, the room seemed to shift. The walls pulsed like living tissue, and the light above grew dimmer, casting everything in a sickly, reddish glow. Shadows danced across the room, shapes that seemed almost human, but twisted and wrong. Whispers filled the air, voices overlapping in a chaotic chorus. Darren couldn't understand the words, but their tone was unmistakable. Pleading, accusing, despairing. Finally, the nurse held up the heart, her work complete. The symbols on its surface glowed faintly, pulsing in time with its slow, deliberate beats. She smiled, a cold, lifeless smile that sent shivers through Darren's soul. "There," she said, placing the heart back into his chest. "Good as new." Darren expected to feel relief, but instead a crushing weight settled over him. His heart felt heavy, its rhythm unnaturally slow. Each beat echoed in his ears, a constant reminder of what had just occurred. He could feel the symbols etched into its surface, their presence like a brand on his soul. "You'll thank me later," the nurse said, stepping back. "Rest now. The treatment is complete." As darkness closed in around him, Darren realized the horrifying truth. He wasn't leaving this hospital, not as the man he had been. When Darren regained consciousness, the world around him felt different. The cold steel of the examination table was gone, replaced by something damp and uneven beneath him. The air was heavy, thick with the acrid scent of decay and disinfectant. He opened his eyes slowly, his vision blurry and distorted, as if the light around him was being swallowed by shadows. He wasn't in the sterile operating room anymore. Instead, he lay in the middle of a vast, dimly lit ward. Rusted metal beds lined the walls, their frames twisted and broken. Faint whispers filled the air, too soft to understand, but too loud to ignore. The walls were yellowed with age, cracked and peeling, and here and there, dark stains seeped through the paint like festering wounds. But it was the occupants of the beds that made Darren's stomach churn. Each bed was occupied, yet none of the figures seemed alive. The bodies were gaunt, their skin pale and stretched tight over their bones. Some had their faces turned toward him, their hollow eyes staring with a mixture of despair and accusation. Others thrashed weakly, as if caught in an endless nightmare. 4 lines dangled from skeletal arms, connected to bags filled with black, viscous fluid. Darren tried to sit up, but the weight in his chest made it nearly impossible. His heart, if it could still be called that, felt unnatural, as though it were something foreign, no longer a part of him. Each beat was heavy and deliberate, echoing through his body like the tolling of a funeral bell. "Help me!" The voice was faint, barely a whisper, but it sent a jolt of fear through Darren. He turned his head toward the sound and saw a woman lying in the bed closest to him. Her face was half hidden in shadow, but her eyes gleamed with a desperate, unnatural light. "Please," she rasped, her voice cracking. "Don't let her come back. She'll take more. She always takes more." Darren struggled to respond, but his throat felt raw, as if he'd been screaming for hours. He tried to push himself up, his arms trembling under his weight. The woman reached out to him, her skeletal hand trembling as it stretched toward his own. Before their hands could touch, a chilling sound echoed through the ward, the rhythmic click of high heels on the cracked tile floor. Darren froze. The woman's eyes widened in terror, and she recoiled, pulling the thin sheet over her face as if it could protect her. The whispers around them grew louder, a cacophony of voices begging, pleading, and sobbing. The nurse was back. She emerged from the shadows at the far end of the ward, her pristine white uniform untouched by the filth around her. The bloody stains from before were gone, replaced by a faint, ghostly glow that seemed to emanate from her very skin. She moved with an unsettling grace, her expression calm but cold, as though she were walking through a garden rather than a room filled with the damned. "Rest," she said softly, her voice carrying over the cries and whispers. "You're all under my care now." As she walked past the beds, the occupants grew silent, their cries stifled by an invisible force. Some thrashed harder, their movements desperate and erratic, while others lay still, their bodies rigid with fear. When her eyes landed on Darren, her smile widened, revealing teeth that were far too sharp. "You're awake," she said, her tone almost cheerful. "That's good. We have more work to do." Darren's heart thundered in his chest, the unnatural rhythm of its beats growing louder and faster. He scrambled to his feet, the cold tile floor biting into his bare soles. His instincts screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The ward stretched endlessly in every direction, the exit nowhere in sight. "Stay back," he croaked, his voice hoarse. The nurse tilted her head, her smile never faltering. "Oh, Darren," she said, her tone dripping with mockery. "There's no need to be afraid. You're safe here. I'll take good care of you." She took a step closer, and Darren staggered backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He glanced around desperately, searching for anything he could use to defend himself. His eyes landed on a rusted IV pole leaning against one of the beds. Without thinking, he grabbed it, wielding it like a spear. "Don't come any closer," he said, his voice shaking. The nurse stopped, her smile fading. For a moment, her expression was unreadable, but then her eyes narrowed and a flicker of annoyance crossed her face. "You're resisting," she said, her voice low and cold. "That's unfortunate, but it's nothing I can't fix." She raised her hand, and the shadows in the room seemed to come alive. They writhed and twisted, forming dark, sinuous shapes that slithered toward Darren like living nightmares. The whispers grew louder, turning into guttural moans that reverberated through the ward. Darren swung the IV pole wildly, but the shadows were intangible, slipping through his grasp like smoke. One of them wrapped around his ankle, yanking him off his feet. He hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs. The nurse loomed over him, her expression one of cold satisfaction. "Don't fight it," she said. "This is for your own good." The shadows coiled around Darren, pinning him to the floor. He struggled, his screams echoing through the ward, but it was no use. The nurse knelt beside him, her gloved hands reaching for his chest. "You have so much fear," she murmured, "so much pain. Let me take it away." Her hand passed through his skin as though it weren't there, reaching into his chest. Darren's vision blurred, his body convulsing as she grasped his heart. He could feel her touch, cold and invasive, as she began to squeeze. The whispers grew deafening, the shadows tightening their grip. Darren's world faded into darkness, the nurse's chilling smile the last thing he saw. Darkness surrounded Darren, a suffocating void that seemed to stretch on forever. His body felt weightless, as if he were floating in an endless abyss. Yet the icy grip of the nurse's touch still lingered on his chest. His heart thudded slower and slower, each beat a hollow echo in the void. And then, like a match struck in a pitch-black room, a faint light flickered in the distance. It was weak, trembling like a candle in the wind, but it pulled Darren toward it, an unrelenting force drawing him back to the world he thought he had left behind. With a gasp, Darren's eyes flew open. He was back in the ward, but something was different. The room was bathed in an unnatural crimson light, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. The patients in the beds were silent now, their lifeless eyes staring into nothingness. The whispers had ceased, replaced by a low, ominous hum that seemed to vibrate through the very air. And then he saw her. The nurse stood at the far end of the room, her back to him. Her pristine uniform was gone, replaced by something darker, something twisted. Her once glowing skin now looked charred and cracked, black veins snaking up her arms and neck. In her hands she held a surgical scalpel, the blade glinting menacingly in the red light. On the wall behind her, Darren's name was scrawled in jagged, blood-red letters, dripping down like fresh wounds. Beneath it, words began to appear, carved by an invisible hand. One more treatment required. Darren scrambled to his feet, his body trembling with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. He needed to escape, now. His eyes darted around the room, searching for a way out, but the ward seemed endless, stretching into the void. "Leaving so soon, Darren?" the nurse said, her voice echoing unnaturally. She turned to face him, her smile wide and grotesque, her jagged teeth gleaming. "You're not ready yet. The procedure isn't complete." Darren backed away, his hands fumbling for anything he could use as a weapon. His fingers brushed against a shattered piece of glass on the floor, likely from a broken IV bag. He grabbed it, gripping it tightly despite the sharp edges, cutting into his palm. "You're not touching me again," Darren spat, his voice shaking but resolute. "I'm done playing your sick game." The nurse laughed, a hollow, chilling sound that made Darren's blood run cold. "Oh, Darren," she said, taking a step closer. "This isn't a game. This is salvation. You should be grateful." As she advanced, the shadows in the room began to move again, slithering across the floor like serpents. They coiled around Darren's ankles, his wrists, pulling him down with relentless force. He thrashed and screamed, the glass shard slicing deeper into his hand. But the shadows were too strong. The nurse knelt beside him, her cold, lifeless eyes locking onto his. "Let me show you," she whispered, raising the scalpel. "Let me fix you." Darren closed his eyes, bracing for the pain, but then something inside him snapped. A surge of raw, desperate energy flooded his body, and with a primal scream, he swung the shard of glass upward. It connected with the nurse's arm, the blade sinking deep into her flesh. She recoiled with a shriek, black ichor spilling from the wound. The shadows around Darren faltered, their grip loosening just enough for him to break free. He scrambled to his feet, his breathing ragged, and bolted toward the faint outline of a door at the far end of the ward. The nurse's screams followed him, a bone-chilling symphony of rage and anguish. The walls began to shake, the crimson light flickering violently as the shadows writhed and lashed out like living creatures. Darren didn't dare look back. He reached the door, his bloodied hands fumbling with the handle, and threw it open. He stumbled into a narrow hallway, the air cold and suffocating. The sound of the nurse's heels clicking against the floor echoed behind him, growing louder with each passing second. Darren sprinted down the corridor, his legs burning, his heart pounding erratically. The hallway seemed endless, twisting and turning in ways that defied logic. Doors lined the walls, each one identical, each one locked. Darren's desperation grew with every step, his mind racing as he tried to find an escape. And then he saw it, a faint flickering exit sign at the end of the corridor. With every ounce of strength he had left, Darren lunged toward the door beneath the sign. He shoved it open, the cold night air hitting him like a slap to the face. He stumbled out into the darkness, collapsing onto the wet grass outside the hospital. For a moment he just lay there, his chest heaving, his body trembling. He had made it. He was free. But the relief was short-lived. As Darren pushed himself to his feet, he realized something was wrong. The world around him was silent, too silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant sounds of civilization. Just an oppressive, deafening stillness. And then he saw them. Figures stood in the shadows of the trees, their forms twisted and grotesque. Their eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the crimson light that still emanated from the hospital behind him. They moved closer, their bodies contorted in unnatural ways, their faces twisted into expressions of agony and rage. Darren backed away, his heart hammering in his chest. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice breaking. "Stay the hell away from me." The figures didn't stop. They surrounded him, their whispers filling the air, a cacophony of voices all saying the same thing. "Time's up." Darren turned to run, but the nurse was there, her charred, broken form standing in his path. Her scalpel gleamed in the crimson light, her smile as cold and cruel as ever. "You can't escape, Darren," she said softly. "You're mine now." The shadows closed in, and Darren's screams echoed into the night. Story number 5. The old Arkham Grand Opera House stood as a monument to an era of opulence and artistry long since decayed into shadow. Once the crown jewel of the city's cultural elite, it now loomed over its surroundings like a mausoleum for lost dreams. The building's Gothic spires pierced the moonlit sky, its stone gargoyles appearing to sneer at the brave or foolish souls who ventured near. Its grand marquee, which once bore the names of celebrated performers, now displayed only peeling paint and broken bulbs. The locals spoke of it in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously toward the silhouette of its crumbling edifice. The stories surrounding the Arkham Grand were as haunting as they were plentiful. It was said that, during the final performance decades ago, renowned actress Evelyn Blackstone had vanished in the middle of the show. The audience, captivated by her portrayal of a tragic heroine, believed it to be part of the act. Until her mutilated corpse reappeared on stage, a macabre tableau bathed in the dim, flickering lights. The police never solved the case, and the opera house was shut down, left to rot in the bowels of the city's collective memory. Yet some nights passers-by claimed to hear faint strains of music drifting through the air, as though the spirits of the performers still lingered, rehearsing eternally for an audience that would never return. For years, the legend of Evelyn Blackstone in the cursed opera house had been a magnet for ghost hunters, thrill seekers, and skeptics alike. Most left shaken, their bravado replaced with wide eyes and trembling hands. Some didn't leave at all. Samantha Grayson was not the type to believe in ghost stories. A skeptical journalist for the Chronicle, she had built her career on debunking urban legends and exposing charlatans. The Theater of Shadows, as the Arkham Grand had come to be known, was her next assignment. With Halloween approaching, her editor had decided that a feature on the city's most infamous haunted location would be a surefire hit. Accompanied by her photographer, Jacob Morris, Samantha approached the rusted gates of the opera house. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone and decay. "It's just an old building," she muttered to herself, brushing aside the unease that prickled at the edges of her mind. Jacob, however, was less composed. "This place gives me the creeps," he admitted, adjusting the strap of his camera bag. "I don't know why we couldn't just write about a haunted diner or something." "Because haunted diners don't sell papers," Samantha replied, flashing him a smirk. "Come on, let's get this over with." The gate groaned in protest as she pushed it open, the sound echoing like a mournful wail. The courtyard was overgrown with weeds, the cracked marble fountain at its center long dry. Samantha's flashlight beam cut through the darkness as they approached the main entrance. The massive double doors were adorned with intricate carvings of theatrical masks. Comedy and tragedy, their expressions warped and menacing in the moonlight. Inside, the air was stifling, heavy with the scent of mildew and something else. Something faintly metallic. Their footsteps echoed through the cavernous lobby, where once grand chandeliers hung like skeletal remains from the ceiling. The ticket booth was shattered, its glass strewn across the floor like frozen tears. "This is great," Jacob whispered, his camera clicking as he captured the desolate beauty of the space. "Creepy as hell, but great." Samantha nodded, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Despite her skepticism, the stories of headless performers and phantom audiences lingered in her mind. She shook it off, focusing instead on her task. "Let's head to the main stage," she said. "That's where the real story is." The auditorium was a cavern of darkness, its once plush seats now tattered and coated in layers of dust. The stage loomed ahead, its velvet curtains hanging in tatters. Samantha's flashlight swept across the room, illuminating faded murals on the walls and the cracked ceiling above. Jacob followed closely, his camera capturing every eerie detail. As they approached the stage, a chill settled over them, the air growing colder with each step. Samantha's breath fogged in the beam of her flashlight. "Feels like we just walked into a freezer," Jacob muttered, shivering. They climbed onto the stage, the warped floorboards creaking beneath their weight. Samantha's flashlight illuminated the grand piano at center stage, its keys yellowed and broken. "This is where Evelyn Blackstone performed her last role," she said, her voice reverent despite herself. Right before she trailed off as a sound echoed through the auditorium, a faint melodic hum. Jacob froze, his camera poised. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Samantha nodded, her pulse quickening. The hum grew louder, resolving into a haunting melody. It seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, an otherworldly sound that wrapped around them like a vice. Then the shadows began to move. At first they thought it was a trick of the light, but as the darkness coalesced into distinct shapes, their disbelief gave way to terror. Figures emerged, their forms fluid and indistinct, as though sculpted from smoke. They were dressed in the finery of opera performers, suits, gowns, and feathered hats, but their heads were missing, their necks ending in jagged stumps. The shadows glided across the stage, their movements graceful yet grotesque. Samantha and Jacob stood frozen, their breaths shallow as the phantom performers began to rehearse their silent act. The melody ceased abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. One by one, the shadows turned toward the intruders, their eyeless gazes piercing the darkness. A deep, resonant voice echoed through the auditorium, reverberating in their very bones. "Stay!" Samantha stumbled backward, her flashlight clattering to the floor. "We need to get out of here," she gasped, grabbing Jacob's arm. But as they turned to flee, the pews in the auditorium slammed shut with a deafening crash, sealing their escape. The grand piano began to play on its own, the notes discordant and sinister. The shadows advanced, their movements slow and deliberate. Samantha's mind raced, her journalistic curiosity battling her primal fear. She fumbled for her recorder, desperate to capture evidence of this nightmare. "Why are you here?" the voice boomed, shaking the very foundation of the building. The shadows halted, their forms quivering as though awaiting a command. Samantha summoned her courage, her voice trembling as she spoke. We came to uncover the truth." The voice chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "The truth? The truth is pain. The truth is death. You have no place here." Jacob screamed as one of the shadows lunged toward him, its ethereal hands grasping at his throat. Samantha watched in horror as he was lifted off the ground, his body convulsing. The shadow released him, and he crumpled to the stage, his eyes wide and unseeing. "Run!" Samantha whispered to herself, her legs finally obeying. She bolted toward the wings, the shadows in pursuit. Her mind raced with fragments of prayers, curses, and desperate pleas for survival. She stumbled into a hidden staircase, its steps spiraling downward into the bowels of the opera house. The walls around her seemed to pulse, as though alive. The air grew thicker, the metallic scent intensifying. Samantha burst into a dimly lit chamber, its walls lined with grotesque masks. At the center of the room stood a pedestal upon which rested an ornate mirror. Its surface shimmered like liquid, reflecting not her own face but that of Evelyn Blackstone. "Take your place," the voice commanded, now emanating from the mirror itself. The shadows closed in, their jagged forms merging into a single, towering figure. Samantha's scream was cut short as she was pulled into the mirror, her body vanishing in a flash of blinding light. The auditorium was silent once more. The phantom performers resumed their rehearsal, their movements flawless and eternal. And in the mirror, a new face joined the gallery, her mouth frozen in a scream, her eyes filled with despair. The Arkham Grand Opera House remained as it always had, waiting for the next audience. Samantha's breathing quickened as she stepped onto the shadowy stage. The world behind her, Harrison, the glowing safety of the theater's exit, seemed impossibly distant, like a half-remembered dream. The black void of the audience stared back at her, silent and expectant. For a fleeting moment, she thought she heard applause, distant, faint, and wrong, as if 1,000 dry hands were clapping underwater. The towering figure of Evelyn Blackstone loomed closer, her mutilated face partially illuminated by a ghostly spotlight. Samantha tried to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. The stage floor beneath her felt like molasses, sticky and unyielding. She glanced down and gasped. The dark wood of the stage was bleeding. Thick crimson rivulets seeped from invisible wounds, pooling around her shoes and climbing up her legs like hungry vines. "You've come for the finale," Evelyn hissed, her voice a dreadful harmony of agony and triumph. "You'll play your part beautifully." Samantha shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face. "I don't belong here. Let me go." But Evelyn only grinned, her exposed teeth like jagged shards of glass. She raised a skeletal hand, and from the wings emerged the other performers, figures swathed in darkness, their heads missing but their bodies moving with eerie precision. Each held a bloodied instrument, a violin missing strings, a cracked cello, and a piano whose keys appeared to be human teeth. The music began. A discordant melody filled the air, every note clawing at Samantha's sanity. The sound wasn't just heard, it was felt, like needles burrowing into her skin. Her mind screamed for escape, but her body betrayed her, pulled like a puppet into the center of the stage. Her arms rose against her will, her lips parting to sing. "No," she cried, but the words emerged as a haunting melody. Her voice wasn't her own. It was sweet, mournful, and filled with unbearable sorrow. The shadows in the audience leaned forward, their indistinct shapes shifting hungrily. As the music reached its crescendo, Samantha's reflection in the blood pooling at her feet caught her eye. It wasn't her. The face staring back was pale, with sunken eyes and lips stitched shut with black thread. Her reflection smirked, then raised a hand and waved at her. The applause thundered again, louder this time. The shadowy audience stood and clapped furiously, their disjointed hands making hollow, unnatural sounds. "Encore!" a voice boomed, deep and commanding. The stage trembled, and the walls of the opera house seemed to close in, pulsating as if alive. Samantha felt the stitches forming on her lips, binding her screams inside her throat. Her chest ached, her heart pounding slower, weaker, until it felt like it might stop altogether. And then she saw them, the other performers, their shadowy forms sharpening into grotesque clarity. Their bodies were stitched together with sinew and bone, their mutilated faces grinning with endless torment. Among them was Harrison, his hollow eyes locked onto hers, a silent plea trapped in his twisted expression. "Evelyn!" Samantha managed to choke out through the searing pain in her lips. "You don't have to do this. You can stop." Evelyn's laughter echoed, cold and merciless. "Stop? My dear, the show must always go on." The curtains, heavy and blood-soaked, began to close around Samantha. The last thing she saw was Harrison reaching for her, his hands skeletal and trembling, before the darkness consumed them both. Would Samantha join the damned chorus, trapped forever in the theater of shadows? Or would she become something far worse, a leading act in a play that never ends? Samantha's consciousness swirled in a fog of numbness. She could feel the weight of the darkness pressing against her chest, suffocating her thoughts. It was as if her body no longer belonged to her. Her limbs moved mechanically, a lifeless marionette pulled by invisible strings. Her once warm, familiar world had been replaced by an endless abyss of shadow and dread. Her mind screamed in protest, but the voice was distant, muffled beneath the oppressive atmosphere of the opera house. She was surrounded by the shadows of the performers, figures that now resembled tortured souls bound to the stage for all eternity. Their faces, twisted and malformed, stared back at her with hollow eyes, watching as she stood at the center of the stage like a puppet in a grotesque dance. The orchestra played, its discordant notes ringing through the cavernous space, reverberating off the stone walls. The shrill strings and hollow brass sent waves of dread crashing over Samantha, but she could no longer discern where the music ended and her heartbeat began. It felt as though the sound itself was inside her, pulsing through her veins. Harrison's tortured expression was now locked in place. His body, contorted and decayed, stood among the other performers, forever frozen in his final, twisted moment. His mouth moved, but no sound escaped. It didn't matter. He was trapped, just like her. A sudden, cold hand clamped around her wrist, snapping her attention back to Evelyn Blackstone, who appeared beside her like a vision from hell. The actress, or what was left of her, was no longer the ethereal beauty she had once been. Her face was a mangled mess of burnt flesh and stitched skin, her hollow eyes dripping with the remnants of her brutal death. "You're not just a guest in my play," Evelyn whispered, her voice like broken glass scraping across a floor. "You're my understudy now. You're going to play the role perfectly, Samantha, just like me, just like the others." Her breath caught in her throat as Evelyn's hands gripped her tighter, pulling her closer to the center of the stage. "Welcome to your new life," Evelyn hissed, smiling a grotesque grin. "You'll never leave." Samantha struggled against Evelyn's grip, but it was futile. The hands holding her were like cold iron, and the longer she struggled, the tighter the grip became, squeezing the breath from her chest. The audience's eyes, glowing red and filled with dark hunger, bore into her soul. They wanted her to stay. They needed her to stay. In a frantic attempt, Samantha looked around, searching for any sign of escape. Her eyes flitted desperately over the faces of the other performers. Some were unrecognizable, others half-human, their flesh and bones twisted beyond recognition. They were all trapped in their roles, their performances frozen in endless loops of agony. Some stared at her with pity, while others grinned maliciously, their eyes empty and hollow, void of any humanity. Samantha's breath quickened as she realized the horrific truth. There would be no escape. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking, hoarse from the terror that gripped her heart. "Please let me go. I don't belong here." But Evelyn only chuckled. "You belong here more than you realize," she purred. "You always have." Suddenly, the spotlight shifted, casting an eerie glow on the giant blood-red curtains behind them. The phantom audience rose from their seats, clapping in perfect unison. The applause was deafening, too loud, too much. It echoed in her mind, amplifying her panic. And then, in the silence that followed, the curtains parted. The air grew thick with an overwhelming stench, old blood, decay, and something far worse. The shadows swirled around the stage, enveloping her in an impenetrable darkness. A faint whisper danced on the edge of her hearing, so soft it might have been her imagination. But it wasn't. The words reverberated, growing louder with each passing second. "Take your seat. You belong to us now." The audience's eyes glowed brighter, and the shadows shifted closer, circling the stage like a ravenous beast. They were hungry. For her. Samantha's pulse raced in her throat as she was dragged helplessly toward the front of the stage, where an empty chair sat in the middle. It was her seat, her final destination. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, the cold realization sinking in. This was it. There would be no escape, no savior. The play had no end. As she was forced into the chair, her body locked in place, the shadows moved in, their cold hands tightening around her. The walls of the theater seemed to stretch and shift, bending and breaking under the weight of the horror that surrounded her. Her body jerked violently, her skin writhing in pain, as if it were being torn from the inside out. Her eyes burned, her lips cracked, and her chest tightened with an overwhelming sense of suffocation. Evelyn's laughter echoed around her, louder now, mingling with the shrill cries of the other performers. It was a choir of suffering, of endless torment, as each one of them reached out for her, beckoning her to join them. They had all been here before, trapped in this place, forever bound to the stage, playing their parts in an eternal, nightmarish performance. Samantha's vision blurred as the final horrifying truth hit her. She had become one of them. The audience's applause reached a deafening crescendo, and as the last notes of the phantom performance filled the air, Samantha's soul screamed in agony. But no sound emerged. The shadows surrounded her, their grip tightening, pulling her into the darkness that was now her reality. And just before the final curtain fell, closing her in with the other lost souls, she saw one last thing, a flicker of light. Harrison, his lifeless form, stood among the performers, his mouth open in an eternal scream. And then, darkness. Samantha's senses were overwhelmed by the suffocating darkness that consumed her. The air in the opera house had grown thick with an acrid metallic scent, like blood mingled with decay. The world around her felt unreal, as though the lines between the living and the dead had blurred completely. She could still feel the tight, invisible hands of the shadows gripping her, holding her in place as if her body was no longer hers to control. Her heartbeat thudded loudly in her chest, yet it felt as if it were slowing down with each passing moment, the pressure building up until it threatened to crush her entirely. The whispers around her were growing louder, curling around her like tendrils of smoke, wrapping themselves around her thoughts. "You belong to us now, Samantha. You will never leave." The voice was Evelyn's, yet it felt like it came from everywhere. The shadows whispered it, the walls echoed it. Even the very floor beneath her seemed to breathe the words into her skin, beneath her flesh and into her soul. Her throat tightened with a desperate scream, but it was strangled in the void. Her voice, like everything else in this forsaken place, was trapped, silenced as if it was swallowed by the consuming darkness. The stage was now completely submerged in blackness, save for a single, cruel light that blazed above her. It illuminated nothing but her own fear-stricken face, staring back at her from a mirror she couldn't see. The chair she sat in felt like a tomb. Every fiber of her being screamed to escape, to run from this nightmare, but there was nowhere to go. The darkness had swallowed all paths. The applause from the phantom audience continued, but it no longer sounded like applause. It had morphed into a steady rhythmic pounding, a heartbeat of something monstrous, something ancient. The audience wasn't applauding her. They were waiting. Samantha's mind raced, grasping for any shred of reason, any glimpse of reality. She couldn't die, not like this. She had so much left to live for, so many unfinished dreams. She had to fight. But how? How could she escape when everything she had ever known had turned into an endless maze of horrors? A cold, clammy hand pressed against her shoulder, and she froze, her breath catching in her throat. She knew who it was before she even turned to face it. Harrison. His eyes were hollow, empty sockets that stared at her with an agonizing, infinite sadness. His body was a grotesque shell of the man she once knew. His skin sagging and rotting, his mouth twisted in a final scream that would never end. His presence was suffocating, like a heavy weight pressing on her chest. He reached out toward her, his bony fingers brushing the side of her face in a gentle, almost loving gesture. "We are all trapped here," he whispered, his voice barely a breath. It was strange, as if he was speaking from the depths of the earth itself. "You are now part of the performance. Forever." Samantha's chest tightened with fear, her lungs fighting to pull in air. She wanted to scream, but no sound came. Her hands began to tremble uncontrollably, the raw terror of what she was becoming. A shadow, a mere puppet in a twisted play. She wanted to push him away, but she couldn't move. Her body was paralyzed, the darkness too heavy to fight. Harrison's expression softened for a fleeting moment, and he leaned closer to her. "There's no way out. The show never ends." A horrific realization struck Samantha like a lightning bolt. The audience wasn't clapping because they were impressed. They were clapping because they were hungry. They wanted her. And once the play ended, Once the final curtain fell, she would be one of them, a shadow, an empty shell of her former self. Her body began to ache, the pain spreading like wildfire through her veins. The shadows around her shifted, pressing against her, suffocating her in a cold, clammy grip. A hollow sound reverberated through the stage, like the groan of the earth's crust shifting under pressure. The spotlight above her flickered, casting eerie, fractured shadows across the stage. The air felt like it was thick with poison, and every breath she took felt more like a betrayal of her own body. Then, with terrifying slowness, the curtain began to rise. The ghostly figures around her started to stir, each one a distorted, decayed version of the performers that had been trapped in this hellish place before her. The audience's claps grew louder, their cheers turning to distorted shrieks of anticipation. The shadows in the wings moved, their limbs jerking with unnatural speed, their eyes fixed on her. The final act was about to begin. "No," Samantha whispered, the word a mere croak in her throat. "No, please." But no one answered. Harrison's ghostly form faded into the shadows, and the walls of the theater trembled as if something large and monstrous was about to break free. The shadows on the stage were no longer performers. They were hungry, and now they were turning their attention on her. With the force of a stampede, they rushed toward her, enveloping her in a cold, suffocating grip. Her limbs screamed for movement, but they wouldn't respond. Her eyes locked on the phantom audience, their faces now contorted into grotesque masks of hunger and malice. They were watching her. They had always been watching her, waiting for the moment when she would join them, when she would become one of them. Her chest tightened as invisible hands pressed against her body sinking further into the chair, each second pulling her deeper into the darkness. The lights dimmed once more, and she felt the coldness seeping into her very soul, as if the darkness were consuming her from the inside out. The curtain fell, but it wasn't the end. The applause roared, deafening in its intensity, and Samantha's mind shattered under the weight of it. Her body trembled as it began to freeze, her senses fading as the shadows closed in. She could feel her own consciousness slipping away, her memories, her hopes, everything that had made her human, now dissolving into the void. The darkness claimed her at last, swallowing her whole. And as the final note of the performance rang out in her ears, the world around her went silent, forever. And thus, the story of Samantha's final performance became another tale of terror in the theater of shadows, a place where no soul ever truly leaves, trapped in the unending cycle of the phantom play. Story number 6. The sound of footsteps echoed down the empty hallway. The dormitory was silent, too silent, but it hadn't always been that way. There had been a time when laughter filled the rooms, when the dormitory had been alive with chatter, and the excitement of young girls settling in for another year at the prestigious boarding school. That was before the disappearances. The once vibrant girls' dormitory had been abandoned. The high stone walls that had witnessed years of joyous celebrations were now cold and silent. What had happened in this place to make it so terrifying, to make it so forgotten? They said the spirits of the lost girls still lingered here. Some claimed they could hear their cries, faint and mournful, echoing in the halls at night. Locals who lived nearby dared not venture close to the crumbling building after dark. It had been shut down after the mysterious disappearances, each one more chilling than the last. But no one knew why they vanished, or what had truly happened inside. It was late in the evening when Claire, a curious young journalist, decided she would find out. She had heard rumors about the old girls' dormitory for years, but she had never believed them, until now. After researching for months, Claire had managed to convince her editor that this story was worth pursuing. She had read through the old records, the accounts of the girls who had lived there, and the chilling reports from the townspeople who had witnessed strange occurrences. One thing was certain: something had happened in that dormitory that had caused it to be shut down. The headmistress had vanished along with several students, and no one had been able to explain why. It was with a mix of excitement and trepidation that Claire stood in front of the looming building, the broken windows staring at her like hollow eyes. The sun had just set, casting a golden glow over the abandoned structure, but the sky was already growing darker by the minute. She didn't mind the isolation or the eerie silence that enveloped the building. She had spent much of her life seeking out stories that others were too afraid to tell. But as she stepped through the rusted gates and into the grounds, a deep unease settled in her chest. The dormitory was silent. There were no birds in the trees, no sound of wind rustling through the broken shutters. Just a heavy stillness that seemed unnatural. The building had long since been abandoned, its windows boarded up and the doors locked. But Claire had come prepared. With a flashlight in hand, she moved towards the main entrance, careful not to disturb the overgrown ivy that clung to the stone walls. The air smelled damp, and the ground beneath her feet was soft with the weight of years of neglect. When she reached the door, she found it ajar, as though it had been waiting for her. Inside, the air was thick and stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. Dust particles floated in the dim beam of her flashlight, creating a strange atmosphere. The walls were lined with faded portraits of the girls who once lived there, their faces blurred by time, but their eyes still staring out at her, like silent witnesses to the horrors that had occurred within these walls. Claire took a deep breath, steeling herself against the creeping sense of dread that began to take root in her chest. She had heard the stories, the girls who had vanished without a trace, the whispers of strange noises at night, the voices that echoed from the empty rooms. But she didn't believe in ghosts. She didn't believe in the supernatural. She was here for the truth. She walked down the long hallway, her flashlight casting jagged shadows along the walls. The silence was deafening. No creak of floorboards, no wind howling through the cracked windows, just the sound of her own breathing, and then faintly in the distance, she thought she heard something else, a whisper. It was soft at first, barely audible, but then it grew louder, a voice calling her name. Claire! The voice was faint, but it was unmistakable. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. Claire! The voice came again, this time closer, as though it was just behind her. Whipping around, Claire swung her flashlight across the hallway, but there was nothing there. The hallway was empty, save for the long rows of old doors, some ajar, others completely sealed. Her skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, but there was no one here. She was alone. Shaking off the unease, Claire pushed forward, determined to find the heart of the story. She continued down the hallway, passing the old dormitory rooms. She opened the first door on her right. The room inside was small, with rows of now dusty bunk beds. The furniture was old, but it looked untouched, frozen in time. It was as if the girls who once lived here had simply vanished without a trace. But something was wrong. The room felt cold, not in temperature, but in presence. There was an unnatural stillness to it, like something was waiting just out of sight. Claire stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room. Her flashlight landed on the bed closest to the window. The sheets were folded neatly, but there was something on the mattress. A dark stain. Her heart skipped a beat. It was a blood stain, a deep red that had soaked into the fabric, but there were no signs of any other disturbance. No bodies, no evidence of a struggle, just the stain, as if someone had left it behind as a reminder of what had happened here. Claire backed out of the room, feeling her breath catch in her throat. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every door she passed seemed to hold its own secret, its own whispering voice. Suddenly, the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She heard it again, the faintest sound, like a whisper. Come, sleep with us. Claire's stomach turned. She had to leave. She turned toward the exit, but before she could take a single step, the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. Her heart raced as she tried to open it, but it was stuck. She pulled harder, but the door wouldn't budge. Let me out, she screamed, her voice echoing through the empty halls. But there was no answer, no footsteps, no sounds of movement, just the oppressive silence. Then in the distance, she heard something else, a sound that sent a chill down her spine. Crying, soft, pitiful cries that echoed through the empty halls, coming from every direction. Claire's blood ran cold as the whispers grew louder. Sleep with us. Sleep with us. Claire's heartbeat echoed in her ears, each thud louder and faster as she stumbled back down the hallway. The door slammed shut with a deafening crash, sending a jolt through her entire body. For a split second, she just stood there, frozen in place, trying to process what had happened. Her breath came in sharp, ragged gasps as she turned her flashlight toward the closed door. "Let me out!" she shouted again, her voice breaking. But no response came. No footsteps, no rustling of fabric, no whispered cries, just the unbearable silence. With shaking hands, Claire reached for the doorknob and tried to open it. It was stuck. Her pulse quickened, panic flooding her chest as she yanked harder. But the door refused to budge. The lock had jammed, or perhaps it had been sealed from the other side. Her chest tightened, and the air in the room felt thick, like it was suffocating her with every breath. The cries from earlier hadn't stopped. Now they seemed to come from every direction, bouncing off the walls, echoing down every hallway, every room. Soft, mournful sobs that seemed both distant and near, filling her head with 1,000 voices. "Help! Help us!" Claire spun around, looking for the source of the cries. But the hallway was empty. The dim light from her flashlight revealed nothing but empty doors and faded portraits of the girls who once lived here. It felt like the walls were closing in on her, like they were watching her, waiting for something. Her throat tightened as she swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. She wasn't alone. She could feel the eyes on her, the presence of something or someone lurking just beyond the reach of her flashlight. Something that was waiting for her to make a mistake, to slip into a trap that had been set long before she arrived. Taking a shaky step forward, Claire moved further down the hallway. The cries seemed to follow her, growing louder, more insistent. "Please," they begged, "stay with us." She flinched at the words. "Who are you?" she whispered, hoping her voice didn't betray the fear crawling up her spine. But there was no answer, just the sound of her own voice bouncing off the walls. She pressed on, her flashlight beam flickering erratically, casting long, stretching shadows across the floor. She tried to ignore the sensation of being watched. She had to find a way out. There had to be a way out. The next door she tried to open was locked, the handle stiff under her grasp. She cursed under her breath, moving to the next door. Her fingers trembled as she gripped the doorknob, turning it gently. This time, it creaked open with a sickening groan, revealing a dimly lit room inside. It was an old dormitory, much like the others, but something was different. This one felt colder. Inside, the air smelled damp, musty, like something had been trapped there for years. The room was littered with old, broken furniture. The once white bed sheets were now torn and yellowed with age. There were no windows in this room, just peeling paint and the thick smell of mildew. As Claire stepped inside, the floor creaked beneath her, the noise echoing in the silence. Her flashlight beam danced across the walls, briefly illuminating a row of empty beds. But something wasn't right. One of the beds was made up perfectly, as if someone had just tucked in the sheets. A soft, pristine white against the otherwise decaying surroundings. Suddenly, a chilling thought crossed her mind. What if someone had been here recently? What if she wasn't the only one in the building? A nervous shiver crawled down her spine, but she pushed it away. She had to stay focused. She had to finish what she came here to do. Her attention was drawn to the bed in the far corner, where a dark stain marred the otherwise clean sheets. It looked like blood, old blood, dried and caked into the fabric. The sight of it sent a wave of nausea through her stomach. She took a step back, her flashlight trembling in her hand as it shone on the stained sheets. Claire bent down, examining the dark patch. There was something else, something embedded in the blood. Dark, twisted shapes, almost like letters or symbols, were faintly visible beneath the stain. She leaned in closer to make out the shapes, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't a name, it was something worse, a series of symbols, drawn hastily in the blood, curved and contorted in unnatural ways, like some sort of ancient language. Her mind raced to decipher them, but the more she looked, the more the symbols seemed to move on their own. shifting before her eyes. Who did this? Claire muttered to herself, feeling the cold grip of fear tighten around her chest. The room seemed to grow colder, the temperature dropping rapidly. Claire stood up, instinctively wrapping her arms around herself for warmth. Her breath formed visible clouds in the air, and the floor beneath her feet began to creak ominously as if someone, was walking above her. A floorboard cracked sharply behind her, and Claire whipped around, her flashlight darting across the room. Nothing. Just the same dusty room, the same empty beds, the same decaying walls. But she wasn't alone. She knew that much now. A noise came from behind her. Soft footsteps, so faint that at first she thought they were just in her head. But then they grew louder, closer, like someone was walking toward her from the dark corner of the room. Claire's breath hitched in her throat, and she slowly turned around. There was a figure in the shadows. It was tall and hunched, its outline vague, but the sense of something moving toward her was unmistakable. She could hear the faint shuffle of its feet on the floor, the rasp of breath, but no other sounds. Her body froze, unable to move, unable to scream. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice barely a squeak. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it stepped closer, emerging from the shadows with a slow, deliberate gait. The pale face of a girl came into view, her eyes wide, her expression frozen in a silent scream. Claire gasped, stumbling backward, but the figure kept advancing, its hands outstretched as if beckoning her closer. "No, no," Claire whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't real. This isn't real." But the figure didn't stop. It reached out, its icy fingers brushing her skin, and Claire recoiled, feeling the coldness sink into her very bones. Her pulse raced. She turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her in the room with the ghostly figure. The girl's eyes locked onto hers, her mouth opening to speak, but no words came out. Instead, a thin, shrill wail filled the room, a deafening scream that vibrated through the walls. Claire's ears rang with the sound, and she tried to shield herself, her hands clutched to her ears. But it was no use. The shadowy figure lunged forward, grabbing Claire's arm with a force that left her gasping for air. She struggled, but the grip tightened, pulling her toward the bed. A soft voice echoed in her mind, "Stay with us." Claire's body was stiff, every muscle refusing to obey her, as the shadowy figure dragged her toward the bed. Panic surged within her, but it felt like she was trapped in a dream, unable to wake up. The ghostly girl's grip on her arm was unyielding, her cold fingers digging into Claire's skin. "Please, let me go!" Claire cried, struggling with all her might. But the ghost didn't respond. She merely pulled Claire closer to the bed, her face expressionless as she continued her march. With a final tug, Claire was thrown onto the bed, her body hitting the sheets with a sickening thud. The room around her seemed to shift and blur, like reality itself was beginning to unravel. Suddenly, Claire's mind was clouded with a horrible thought. It wasn't just the dormitory that was haunted. It wasn't just the ghosts of the girls who had vanished. She had heard the stories, the rumors whispered by locals, that if you stayed too long, if you slept in the dormitory, you wouldn't wake up. Instead, you would become one of them. Trapped forever. The cold fingers of the ghost released their grip on her, but the fear still gripped Claire's chest. The room seemed to grow darker, the shadows stretching unnaturally as the walls seemed to close in on her. She tried to move, but her body felt heavier, like the weight of centuries was pressing down on her. The whispers began again, soft at first, then louder. "Sleep with us. Sleep with us forever." And just as Claire felt the darkness consume her, a sharp, suffocating cold gripped her heart. Something deep inside her, a primal instinct, told her that she wasn't going to make it out, not alive. The bed beneath her seemed to melt away, and the cold earth rose up, wrapping around her, suffocating her. Her breath slowed, her chest tightening, until everything went black. Story number 7. The orphanage had always been the stuff of whispered legends. Its looming silhouette on the outskirts of town had always held an air of mystery, even when it was still operational. Locals would glance nervously at the building, their eyes flicking from the once vibrant facade to the shadows of the woods that bordered the property. Back then, the orphanage had been home to countless children, orphans from broken homes, children who had lost their parents, or those abandoned by society. For years, the institution had served its purpose, providing a roof over their heads, food, education, and in some cases, the only semblance of love they had ever known. But then, things changed. The whispers began. Children began to vanish from their beds in the dead of night, their bodies never found. All that remained were their shoes, abandoned and neatly arranged in the hallway, as if they had just stepped out of them moments before disappearing. It was the same pattern, night after night. The staff had no explanation. The police, when called, could not fathom how children were slipping away without a trace. Soon the stories turned darker. The children who had vanished were said to be seen walking toward the end of a hallway that, according to many, didn't even exist anymore. Those who dared investigate would return, visibly shaken, murmuring about strange sounds and whispers, about the sense of something or someone following them through the hallways. And then, as quickly as it all started, the orphanage shut its doors for good. Despite the official closure, rumors still floated about the place. Every now and then, a group of curious teenagers would sneak onto the property, daring one another to enter the building. They'd come back with tales of shadowy figures moving behind windows, eerie noises drifting from the empty hallways, and cold, skeletal hands brushing against their skin in the dead of night. But no one ever, stayed long enough to find out the truth. It wasn't until I found myself standing at the gates of the abandoned orphanage that I understood. I had grown up on those rumors, on the unsettling stories shared by friends, neighbors, and even adults who whispered in hushed tones about what had really happened to the children. The missing children, the hallway that led nowhere, the mysterious voices that echoed from within the walls. I wasn't here for thrills or a cheap scare. I had a different purpose. I was a journalist, and my curiosity had been piqued. There was more to this story, more than the townsfolk had ever realized, and I was determined to find the truth, no matter what it took. I stood at the gates, my flashlight in hand, the night air crisp against my skin. The old iron gates were rusted, the tall brick walls encasing the orphanage covered in ivy and moss. The building itself loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, a haunted relic of a time long gone. Despite the decay, there was a strange kind of pull, an invitation that beckoned me forward. I took a deep breath and stepped through the gates. My heart pounded in my chest as the shadows seemed to swallow me whole. This place, this forsaken orphanage, had a story to tell, and I would be the one to uncover it. The wooden door creaked as I pushed it open, the smell of mildew and decay hitting me instantly. Inside, the orphanage was eerily silent, save for the occasional groan of the old building settling beneath the weight of time. Dust coated the floor, the remnants of years of neglect. My flashlight beam danced across the hallway, illuminating peeling wallpaper, cracked frames, and rotting furniture strewn carelessly in the corners. I hesitated for a moment, the weight of the stories I had heard pressing down on me. The hallway before me seemed to stretch infinitely, like a dark artery that led nowhere. A strange chill wrapped itself around me, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Something about this place felt alive, as if the walls themselves had witnessed things too terrible to comprehend. I couldn't back down now. I had to find out what happened. Why did the children disappear? What had driven the orphanage to shut its doors after so many years of service? The truth was somewhere inside these walls, and I was going to find it. I moved cautiously, my flashlight's beam flickering with every step I took. The floor beneath me creaked, groaning in protest as if the building itself resented my presence. The farther I walked, the more it felt like I was being watched, like eyes were peering through the cracks in the walls, waiting for me to make a mistake. The hallway stretched out before me, a narrow passage lined with old doors, some open, some sealed shut with rusted nails. Each door led to rooms that had been abandoned long ago. Children's bedrooms, a playroom, a small kitchen. But there was one door at the end of the hall that caught my attention. It was different from the others. Unlike the decaying, worn doors surrounding it, this one looked pristine, almost as if it had been untouched by time. The wood was dark and polished, its frame carved with intricate designs I couldn't make out in the dim light. There was something unnatural about it, a heavy presence that made my stomach churn. I approached the door slowly, my breath shallow. The whispering came then, a faint sound that seemed to rise from the depths of the building itself. At first it was just a murmur, almost inaudible, but then it grew louder, like a chorus of voices rising from the ground beneath me. I froze. "Please help us." The voice was soft, childlike, filled with desperation. I glanced around, my eyes searching the dark corners of the hallway. There was no one in sight. "Please, don't leave us." The whispers became more frantic, as if the voices were pleading for my attention. They were coming from the door, I realized. The door that hadn't aged, and that seemed to exist outside the realm of this decaying building. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my pulse quickened. I had to know. I had to open it. With trembling hands, I reached for the doorknob and turned it. The door creaked open. Behind it, there was nothing but darkness, a void that seemed to consume the light around me, stretching endlessly. I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest, the door creaking shut behind me with a force that made my blood run cold. Suddenly, I wasn't alone. Someone was in the room with me. The air grew heavy, thick with the presence of unseen figures. The temperature dropped, and I could see my breath fogging in the air. I felt the ground shift beneath me, as if the very foundation of the orphanage was alive. The whispers became clearer now, voices from all sides, close enough to touch. They swirled around me like 100 hands reaching out of the dark, pulling me deeper into the room. "Come closer," the voices chanted, their whispers turning to pleading cries. "Come closer and join us." My body screamed for me to turn back, to leave this cursed place, but I couldn't. Something in the air, something in the whispers held me captive. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't escape. The floor beneath me seemed to shift again, and suddenly I realized where I was standing, on the edge of a vast, unseen void. And then I saw it. At the far end of the room, bathed in a faint, eerie glow, there was a hallway. The same hallway that had been sealed off for years. The hallway where the children had disappeared. But now it was alive, its walls trembling as if something was moving within them. The shoes of the missing children lined the path, rows upon rows of tiny shoes. Some were pristine, others covered in dirt and blood. I could hear their faint cries, their tiny voices calling out from the darkness at the end of the hall. They were asking for help, but the hallway didn't answer. It only took. The floor beneath me groaned, as if the building itself was about to collapse. My heart pounded and my breath quickened. I stood frozen, my feet glued to the floor, my eyes fixated on the dark hallway that stretched out before me. The shoes, the cries, it all seemed to pull me in, like a magnet drawing me closer, deeper into the heart of the nightmare. But something within me screamed to turn back, to run, to leave this place before I was swallowed by whatever force lingered here. The air had become thicker, colder, as if the very atmosphere had changed to reflect the malevolent presence surrounding me. I forced myself to take a step forward, though every instinct screamed against it. The wooden floor creaked beneath my feet, echoing through the silence, disturbing the delicate tension that hung in the air. The whispers continued, the voices growing louder and more insistent. They no longer sounded like children begging for help. They sounded like something else, something darker, more twisted. "You can't leave," the voices hissed, their tones low and menacing. "Not unless you give us what we want." A chill ran down my spine. My eyes darted from the hallway to the door I had come through, but it was no longer there. The room I had entered had shifted, the walls bending in on themselves, leaving me with only the hallway ahead. The air felt charged, heavy with anticipation, as though something hung just beyond the reach of my senses, waiting for me to step into the unknown. The shoes on the floor, the children's shoes, remained perfectly arranged as though they were placed there with care, though the chaos of the room surrounding them suggested anything but order. Some of the shoes were so small they could have belonged to toddlers, others slightly larger, perhaps worn by older children. A few pairs were caked in dirt, others soaked in blood, the dark stains a stark contrast to the otherwise pristine surroundings. I couldn't help myself. I took another step forward, drawn by the inexplicable compulsion to walk deeper into the hall. The voices became clearer now, each one distinct, but all carrying the same sense of desperation, their tones merging into a haunting chorus. "Help us," the voices murmured, their words barely audible. "Take us with you. We won't hurt you. We won't." But there was something wrong with the words. They didn't feel genuine. They felt like a trap, a baited hook. I had to resist the pull. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts, but it only made things worse. The floor beneath me trembled, and the walls seemed to grow closer, the hallway narrowing with each step. I could see nothing beyond the stretch of the dark corridor, but the oppressive weight of something malevolent pressed down on me from every side. I had to keep moving. I had to. With a deep breath, I continued forward, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the silence, louder with each passing moment. The hallway stretched ahead, endless, as though it had no end. The shadows in the corners flickered, as though something was watching me, waiting for me to fall into the trap. And then I saw it. At the very end of the hallway, a door. It looked old, the wood worn and cracked, but still intact. There was something unnatural about it, like it had been placed there deliberately, as though to lead me into whatever lay beyond. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening. "Come. Come to us. We're waiting." I stepped forward, compelled by an unseen force. My fingers brushed the door frame, cold as ice. The moment my hand touched the wood, a loud, jarring sound rang through the air, a slamming noise that echoed down the hallway, shaking the very foundation of the orphanage. The door was locked, but it wasn't the lock that stopped me. It was the presence. The moment I laid my hand on the door, the temperature plummeted, and a suffocating darkness enveloped me. My breath became shallow, my chest tightening as if something was closing in on me from all sides. I could hear the cries again, louder now, more frantic, desperate. "It's too late. It's already too late," the voices chanted, the tone shifting from pleading to something darker, something filled with malice. I recoiled, instinctively reaching for the door handle. But it wasn't just the door that had changed. The hallway had transformed, the very walls twisting, distorting as if alive. The shoes scattered along the floor trembled, shifting as though they were moving on their own. The cries grew into shrieks of agony, now unmistakably human, as though 1,000 children were wailing in torment, trapped in the walls, suffocating. I turned, and for the first time since entering this hellish place, I saw them, the children. They were standing in the shadows, their faces gaunt and hollow, their eyes dark pits of despair. They were dressed in ragged clothes, their skin pale and clammy, their bodies unnaturally thin. But it wasn't their appearance that froze me. It was the look in their eyes, the hunger. They didn't want help. They didn't want to be saved. "You will join us," they whispered, their voices overlapping in a chilling harmony. "You will feed us." The moment the words left their mouths, the ground beneath me buckled. The hallway seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as though the very building was alive, breathing in the same darkness that had consumed the children. I stumbled back, but the hallway seemed to stretch impossibly farther, pulling me in, closing off my escape. The door at the end of the hall slammed shut, the sound reverberating like a death knell. And that was when I realized there was no escape. There had never been an escape. I turned to run, but the shadows reached out, grabbing me with cold, skeletal fingers, pulling me back toward the hallway. The cries grew louder, the shadows twisting into shapes that were almost human, their forms shifting, becoming monstrous. "We are the ones who never left," they said, their voices rising in a cacophony of hunger. "And now, you will never leave either." I screamed, but my voice was swallowed by the darkness. And that was when I realized the truth. The hallway didn't eat children. It ate souls. And now it was hungry for mine. The grip on my body tightened, pulling me deeper into the suffocating darkness that consumed everything. I gasped, struggling to break free, but the shadows that clung to me were stronger than I could have ever imagined. I fought, thrashing against them, but each time I attempted to free myself, they wrapped tighter, colder, with an unnatural force that seemed to drain my very essence. The cold air became unbearable, and my chest tightened as if something inside me was being squeezed, pulled out, piece by piece. I could feel it now, the sensation of being eaten alive, but not in the way I had expected. It wasn't my flesh being torn apart. It was my soul, my very being devoured by the malignant presence that surrounded me. I glanced up, barely able to see through the inky blackness. The figures, the children, were still there, but they weren't children anymore. They were something else. Horrible, twisted versions of what they once were. Their faces were contorted in agony, their eyes wide with insatiable hunger, and their mouths were stretched into grotesque smiles that sent chills crawling up my spine. "You're ours now," they whispered, their voices a terrifying blend of laughter and despair. "Forever." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My mouth was dry, my throat closed up, as if something was blocking my voice. The whispers continued, louder now, an overwhelming symphony of torment that pierced my mind. It was like they were inside my head, pushing and pulling at my thoughts, feeding on my fear. The hallway stretched on forever, twisting and distorting, the walls pulsating as if alive. The shoes, their innocent, once cherished shoes, were no longer scattered across the floor. They were gone, replaced by something far worse. The ground was now slick, covered in something wet and viscous, sticky with a dark substance that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. I was being dragged forward, and no matter how hard I tried to resist, my legs would not obey. Every step I took seemed to lead me deeper into the void. The shadows that clung to me were no longer just shadows. They had become part of me, entwining themselves around my body, crawling beneath my skin, seeping into my very soul. "Feed us, feed us," the voices chanted in unison, their words becoming a rhythmic pounding in my skull. "Become one of us." The sound of their whispers turned into screams, loud and shrill, echoing in my ears as I was pulled along the dark corridor. The door at the end of the hallway loomed closer now, its edges cracked and warped, but there was something terribly wrong about it. It wasn't a door, it was a trap. I had no choice but to move toward it, my body no longer under my control, as though something had taken over. My eyes were fixed on the door, and it was all I could see. The shadows that clung to me began to whisper again, their voices becoming almost seductive. "The door will open for you," they crooned. "It will set you free." I wanted to believe them. I wanted to believe that opening the door would end this nightmare, that it would let me escape. But deep inside, something warned me. Something told me that the door was not salvation, but damnation. The closer I got, the more I could see. There was a faint light emanating from the cracks in the doorframe, a sickly yellow glow that seemed to draw me in. But that light was not warmth. It was cold, malevolent, and it burned my eyes just to look at it. Snap. The door creaked open, the sound sending a shiver of dread down my spine. I was mere inches away from it now, the force pulling me closer, inch by inch. The moment the door swung open fully, I was hit with a wave of unrelenting darkness, a blackness that swallowed everything, that consumed light, hope, and the very air I breathed. And then I saw it. Beyond the door was an abyss, a void that stretched on forever, an endless chasm that seemed to lead nowhere. I couldn't see the floor. I couldn't see the walls. It was just darkness. But then came the whisper, "Step into the dark. Let us feed on your soul." Without thinking, without choice, my body obeyed. I stepped forward, my feet sinking into the void, my legs failing me, my arms reaching out for something to grab. But there was nothing. There was nothing but the cold, black nothingness that reached up to claim me. I could feel the shadows closing in, pressing down on me from all sides, suffocating me, drowning me in a sea of darkness. And then I felt it. Hands, cold, clammy hands, gripped me from all directions, pulling at me, tearing at me. I screamed, or at least I tried to, but the darkness swallowed my voice. The pain was unbearable, as if my very essence was being ripped apart, shredded by unseen claws. But it wasn't over. I was no longer alone. The children, those children, their hollow eyes were there. They were all around me now, their skeletal hands reaching out, dragging me deeper into the abyss. Their mouths were wide, gaping, their smiles twisted into grotesque masks of hunger. "You belong to us now," they whispered, the sound coming from all directions, surrounding me, suffocating me. "We will never let you go." I tried to fight back. I fought with everything I had, but it was no use. My body had become a part of this nightmare, a vessel for their insatiable hunger. I was being pulled into the abyss, my body sinking into the dark, never to return. "Welcome to the hallway that eats," the whispers said, their voices filling my ears, overwhelming my mind. "You will never leave. You are ours now, forever." And with that, the darkness consumed me. It's been days, maybe weeks, since I lost track of time. But the emptiness, the darkness, it's still here, wrapped around me like a suffocating blanket. I can't escape. Every movement I make feels futile, as if the void is pushing me back, pulling me further in. I feel weightless, but also unbearably heavy, as if my body is no longer my own, lost in a labyrinth of endless corridors where time has ceased to exist. I don't know where the others are anymore. The children, their faces are blurry, fading in and out of my mind. Their whispers continue to gnaw at my thoughts, persistent and relentless. I can hear them everywhere, in every corner of my mind, speaking in voices that never seem to tire. "You can't run away," they chant in unison. "You can't hide. We will always find you." I want to scream. I want to beg for mercy, but I know it's useless. I've tried. I've tried screaming until my throat bled, tried running, tried pushing back against the invisible force that drags me down this endless hallway. It's all in vain. There's no escape from this place, from them. They're always watching, always waiting. I can feel their eyes on me, cold and unblinking, as if they are inside me, crawling beneath my skin. And the hall, it's alive. The walls pulse with a sickening rhythm, almost like a heartbeat, a slow, deliberate thump that reverberates through my bones. It's not just the darkness that swallows me. It's the crushing weight of the air itself, the pressure of this place. The hallway is closing in, constricting, bending, warping into a form I can't comprehend. Every step I take is one step closer to whatever lies at the end, and I can't shake the feeling that the end is coming for me. But there's more. There are shadows now, shadows that weren't there before. They move, twitching, writhing against the walls. I hear their whispers too, but they're different. These whispers don't sound like the children. They sound like voices, human voices, low, guttural, desperate. "Help us," one voice croaks. "We're trapped, just like you." The shadows stretch across the walls, reaching toward me, but I can't tell if they're trying to help or pull me further into the abyss. I try to back away, but my legs refuse to move. The force that holds me is stronger than before. It drags me forward, and I feel my feet dragging along the cold, wet floor, leaving a trail behind me. My skin is clammy, and I feel the warmth of something wet on my back. I don't want to look. I know what it is. The walls are bleeding. The shadows are closing in now, the whispers growing louder, more frantic. They sound like voices from the past, muffled and distant but unmistakable. "Don't go any further," one voice warns. "It's too late. You'll never escape." But it's too late for me. I can't stop moving. I can't stop being dragged forward. The hall has become a living thing, its walls twisting and turning, becoming more distorted with each passing second. There are no straight lines anymore, no predictable paths. The corridor spirals and bends into unnatural angles, and I realize with a sickening lurch that I'm not even sure if I'm walking anymore. Am I still standing, or am I floating, drifting along the hall, tethered only by the invisible force pulling me forward? Suddenly I hear something different, something real, something alive. Footsteps. I freeze, my heart slamming against my ribs. They're unmistakable. I know these footsteps. I know them. It's a sound I've heard before, though I can't remember where. The sharp, hurried tapping of shoes against the cold floor, echoing down the hallway. But they're not just footsteps. They're getting closer, closer and faster. I can hear heavy breathing now, a rapid intake of air like someone running, desperate, terrified. First turn. I try to turn around, but I'm still held in place. The shadows pull at me, tugging at my limbs as I fight to move. But I'm not alone. I see it now, just ahead of me. A figure, a woman standing at the far end of the hallway. She's moving toward me, but not with the hurried steps I heard earlier. She's walking slowly, deliberately, her head hung low, her hair covering her face. I know her. I recognize her. It's her, the woman from before, the one I saw when I first entered this place, the one who seemed to be in every nightmare I had, the woman who disappeared into the darkness, whose screams echoed in my ears. She's not alone. Behind her I see others, more figures, more shadows, hiding just beyond the light's reach, their faces obscured by the thick, suffocating blackness that seems to leak from the walls. There are more of them, more than I can count, and they're all heading toward me. The woman stops in front of me, just out of reach. Her face is hidden behind strands of matted hair, but I can feel her eyes burning into me. I feel it, a cold, seeping presence in the air around her, like the chill of death itself. "You're here," she whispers, her voice low and haunting. "You've finally come." I try to speak, but my voice is caught in my throat. I try to scream, to run, but I can't. I'm frozen, locked in place, my body betraying me. "You can't escape," the woman whispers again, this time louder, more forceful. "None of us can." I try to back away, but it's no use. The hall has become a prison, a tomb, and the woman is the warden. There's no way out. There never was. "This is where you belong now," she says, her voice growing more distorted, more unnatural. "Just like all the others. You'll be one of us soon. Forever." And as her words sink in, I realize the horrible truth. I've become part of the darkness. There is no escaping. The hallway, the orphanage, the echoes of the lost children, they are all part of me now, and I will never leave. Forever. Now that you've heard these terrifying tales, would you dare visit any of these places? Let us know in the comments. And remember, if you enjoyed the scares, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories that will haunt your nights.